The wind came hard across the Wind River Valley that morning, carrying the smell of sage and snow from the mountains. Grace Hartley stood 3 feet from her father's casket, close enough to see the grain in the polished oak, close enough to count the brass handles, close enough to feel like she was suffocating. The casket was closed. They had told her it was customary. They had told her it was respectful. What they had not told her was that she would spend the entire funeral service staring at that sealed wooden box and wondering if her father was really inside, or if this was all some terrible dream she could not wake from. St. Michael's Church in Riverton, Wyoming, was packed to the rafters. 200 people had come to say goodbye to William Hartley, the man who had built the biggest cattle ranch in Fremont County from nothing but grit and 1,000 borrowed acres. Ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with bankers. Cowboys in clean shirts stood next to lawyers in dark suits. The mayor was there. The county commissioners were there. Half the town had shown up to mourn a man who had spent 40 years proving that hard work and honest dealing still meant something in Wyoming. Grace wore a black dress that no longer fit. She had lost 10 pounds in the week since her father died, and she had pinned the waist that morning with hands that would not stop shaking. Her shoes were scuffed. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like what she was, a 26-year-old elementary school teacher who had not been prepared for her father to die at 68 from a sudden heart attack. She looked like someone who had been told 3 years ago that she was no longer welcome at the ranch, and who had believed it was somehow her fault. But that was not what made the funeral unbearable. What made it unbearable was the woman sitting in the front row, wearing a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than Grace made in a month, checking her phone every 30 seconds like she had somewhere more important to be. Victoria Hartley, the widow, the stepmother, the woman who had married William Hartley 5 years ago and had spent every day since then systematically erasing Grace from his life. Victoria was 44 years old and looked like she had walked out of a magazine. Perfect blonde hair, perfect makeup, perfect manicure. She held a white handkerchief in her lap, but Grace had not seen her use it once. Not during the eulogy, not during Amazing Grace, not when the pastor had talked about William's dedication to family, and Victoria's eyes had flickered toward Grace with something that looked a lot like contempt. Sitting next to Victoria was her son from a previous marriage, Kyle Kane. 23 years old, slicked back hair, a suit that looked like it cost more than Grace's car. He was playing a game on his phone, actually playing a game, at a funeral. Grace watched his thumbs moving across the screen, watched him barely glance up when the pastor mentioned William's generosity, watched him yawn when someone read from the book of Psalms. Grace wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up in the middle of that church and tell everyone the truth. That Victoria had locked the ranch gates 3 years ago and changed the security codes. That she had screened every phone call, deleted every voicemail, told William that Grace was too busy with her own life to visit. That she had slowly, methodically, cruelly isolated a dying man from his only daughter. But Grace did not scream. She stood there in her too big dress and her scuffed shoes, and she let the rage burn quiet and cold in her chest. The pastor said something about ashes to ashes. The organ began to play. People stood. Grace felt someone's hand on her shoulder, an old rancher named Ted Cooper who had worked cattle drives with her father back in the 1980s. He did not say anything. He just squeezed once, gentle, and then moved past her toward the exit. The funeral ended. The crowd filed out into the parking lot where the Wyoming sun was bright and merciless. Grace stood by the door, shaking hands, accepting condolences, hearing the same words over and over. "He was a good man. He will be missed. I am so sorry for your loss." She nodded. She thanked them. She did not tell them that she had not seen her father in 3 years, that she had been calling the ranch every week and getting voicemail, that she had driven out there twice only to be turned away at the gate by ranch hands who said Mrs. Hartley's orders were very clear. No visitors without her approval. Victoria swept past Grace without a word. Kyle followed, still looking at his phone. They climbed into a black Range Rover that was idling at the curb, and they drove away from the church before half the mourners had even made it to their cars. Grace stood alone in the parking lot. The wind pulled at her dress. The mountains in the distance were sharp and white against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She thought about her father teaching her to ride when she was 6 years old. She thought about him reading to her at night until his voice went hoarse. She thought about the way he used to call her Gracie girl and how she had not heard that name in 5 years. She got into her 10-year-old Toyota Civic. The engine coughed twice before it caught. She drove back to her apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, and she sat on her couch in her too big dress, and she did not cry. She was too angry to cry. 2 days later, Grace received a phone call from Robert Anderson, the family attorney. He told her that the reading of William Hartley's will would take place the following afternoon at 2 o'clock. He told her it was important that she attend. His voice on the phone sounded tired, like a man who had not slept in days. Grace said she would be there. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen table and stared at the wall and wondered what her father could possibly have left her, when Victoria had already taken everything that mattered. The law office of Anderson and Partners occupied the second floor of a brick building that had been standing in Riverton since 1920. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. Grace arrived 10 minutes early and found Victoria already seated in the conference room, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity of someone checking stock prices or planning a vacation. Kyle sat beside her, picking at his fingernails with a gold toothpick. Grace took the chair farthest from them. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. Victoria did not look up. Kyle yawned. Robert Anderson entered at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio that looked older than Grace. He was 67, with white hair and deep lines around his eyes, and he had been the Hartley family attorney for 35 years. Grace remembered him from when she was a child, remembered him coming to the ranch for barbecues, remembered him teaching her how to play chess on the back porch while her father grilled steaks. He had kind eyes. But today, those eyes would not quite meet hers, and that was the first sign that something was very wrong. Anderson sat down at the head of the table. He opened the portfolio. He cleared his throat. He said, "Good afternoon." He said, "I am here to read the last will and testament of William Edward Hartley." He put on his reading glasses, and his hands shook just slightly as he broke the wax seal on the document. Victoria straightened in her chair. The hunger in her posture was so obvious it was almost embarrassing. She leaned forward. She put her phone face down on the table. Her eyes locked onto the papers in Anderson's hands like a hawk watching a rabbit. Anderson read in a flat, professional voice that somehow made everything worse. "To my wife, Victoria," he began, "I leave the main ranch house located at 4400 Hartley Road, including all furnishings, artwork, and vehicles contained therein." Victoria let out a breath she had been holding. The ranch house was an 8,000-square-foot log mansion with views of the mountains and a price tag north of $12 million. "I also leave to Victoria," Anderson continued, "the entirety of the ranch operations, including 15,000 acres of grazing land, 2,500 head of cattle, all equipment, barns, stables, and ranch infrastructure. Estimated total value $60 million. Grace felt something cold spread through her chest. It was not surprise. She had known this was coming. But knowing and hearing were two different things. She sat very still and kept her face blank and tried not to let them see how much it hurt. To my stepson, Kyle Kane, Anderson read, I leave the guest quarters, the hunting outfitter business, and all associated vehicles and equipment. Kyle pumped his fist under the table. Grace saw it from the corner of her eye. He was grinning. Anderson cleared his throat again. He finally looked at Grace, and the sadness in his eyes was so profound it almost broke her. And to my daughter, Grace Catherine Hartley, he said, his voice softening just slightly, I leave the property located at mile marker 47, commonly known as the foreman's cabin, including the 120 acres surrounding it. For a moment the room was silent. Then Victoria started laughing. It was a high, sharp sound like glass breaking. The foreman's cabin, she said. You mean that old line shack, the one that has not been used in 30 years. Kyle joined in. He actually threw his head back and laughed. Dad literally gave you a condemned shed, he said, looking at Grace for the first time since she had entered the room. That place is falling apart. It is probably full of rats. Anderson slid a heavy iron key across the polished surface of the conference table. It stopped in front of Grace. The property is fully paid off, he said quietly. Here are the deed and the key. Grace stared at the key. It was old, rust-spotted, the kind of key that looked like it belonged to a horror movie. She picked it up. It was cold and heavier than it looked. She turned it over in her hand and tried to understand what was happening. Is that all? She asked. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. No letter, nothing. Anderson hesitated. Your father was very specific about the distribution, he said. He told me you would understand when you visited the property. Victoria stood up, victorious. She gathered her purse and her phone. She looked down at Grace with something that might have been pity if it had not been quite so cruel. Good luck paying property taxes on a pile of splinters, she said. I guess he finally figured out what you were worth. She smiled. Come on, Kyle. We have dinner reservations in Jackson. They left. The door closed behind them. Grace sat alone in the conference room with Robert Anderson and a rusted key, and a piece of paper that said she owned 120 acres of rocks and sagebrush in the middle of nowhere. Anderson walked around the table. He sat down in the chair next to her. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, Grace, your father came to see me 3 weeks before he died. He was the sharpest man I have ever known, right up until the end. Then why, Grace whispered, why did he hate me? He did not hate you. Anderson's voice was firm. He looked at the door to make sure Victoria was really gone, and then he leaned closer. He told me something when he handed me this will. He said, Victoria counts money. Grace counts memories. She will look closer. Grace looked at the old attorney. What does that mean? I do not know, Anderson admitted, but he made me promise to tell you. He said, trust me, go to the cabin. Grace picked up the deed. She looked at the legal description of the property, all those numbers and letters that meant nothing to her. She looked at the key in her hand. She thought about her father standing in this office 3 weeks ago, dying and knowing it, planning something she could not understand. She stood up. She put the key in her pocket. She folded the deed and tucked it into her purse. She looked at Robert Anderson and said, thank you. Then she walked out of that office and down the creaking stairs and out into the Wyoming afternoon, and she got into her Toyota Civic and she started driving north. The drive to mile marker 47 took 90 minutes. Grace left Riverton on Highway 26, heading northeast into the Bighorn Basin. The road was straight and empty. The land on either side was the kind of landscape that people from back east thought was desolate, all sagebrush flats and alkali soil and distant ridges that shimmered in the heat. But Grace had grown up here. She knew this land. She knew that desolate was just another word for honest, that this was country that did not lie to you or dress itself up in ways it was not. The paved highway gave way to gravel. The gravel gave way to a two-track trail that wound between low hills covered in juniper. Her Toyota bounced over ruts and rocks. Dust rose behind her in a long plume. The cell signal died somewhere around mile 30. Grace kept driving. She almost missed the turnoff. There was no sign, just a gap in the fence line and two tire tracks heading west into rougher country. She turned. The tracks climbed a ridge, dropped into a shallow valley, climbed again. And then, as she crested the second ridge, she saw it. The foreman's cabin sat in a hollow between three hills, sheltered from the wind but exposed to the full weight of the sky. It was a log structure, probably built sometime in the 1940s, maybe earlier. 2 stories, a peaked roof that sagged in the middle like a broken back, windows boarded over with plywood that had turned gray and soft with rot. The front porch had collapsed on one side, leaving the other half tilted at a drunken angle. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation. A rusted hand pump stood in the yard like a gravestone. Grace turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and enormous. No cars, no planes, just wind and the distant call of a hawk. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at the cabin and felt something like despair settle over her shoulders. This was it. This was her inheritance. 120 acres of rock and sage and a building that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it too hard. Victoria had gotten $60 million and a mansion. Grace had gotten this. She got out of the car. The air smelled like dust and pine. Her boots sank into soft dirt as she walked toward the cabin. Up close, it looked even worse. The logs were split and weathered. The chinking between them had crumbled away in places, leaving gaps wide enough to see through. A condemned notice was stapled to the door frame, half torn away by wind. The paper was dated 2 years ago. Grace reached the porch. The steps creaked under her weight. One of them cracked and she had to jump to the next one, heart pounding. She made it to the door. It was a massive slab of oak, scarred and scratched by what looked like animal claws. She pulled the rusted key from her pocket. She tried to fit it into the lock. It would not turn. The lock was seized with rust and age. Grace jiggled the key. She tried to force it, nothing. She stepped back, breathing hard, and for the first time since the funeral she felt tears coming. Not sad tears, angry tears, frustrated tears. The kind of tears that come when you have been holding everything in for too long and your body decides it is done. She was about to throw the key as hard as she could into the sagebrush when she heard a voice behind her say, "You lost, ma'am." Grace spun around. Standing at the edge of the yard, maybe 20 feet away, was an old man. He was holding a rifle slung over his shoulder, not pointing it at her but not exactly putting it away either. He wore a faded denim jacket and suspenders and a cowboy hat that looked like it had survived at least 3 decades of Wyoming weather. His face was weathered leather, deep lines around the eyes, a white mustache that drooped past his chin. He was probably in his 70s. He was watching her with the kind of careful suspicion that people develop when they live alone in the middle of nowhere. "I own this place," Grace said. Her voice came out shaky. She held up the key like it was proof. "My name is Grace Hartley. William Hartley was my father." The man's entire expression changed. The suspicion vanished, replaced by something that looked like shock. He lowered the rifle. He took a step closer, squinting at her in the bright sun. "Will's girl," he said. His voice was rough like gravel in a bucket. "Well, I will be damned. You got his eyes." "You knew my father?" Grace asked. "Knew him?" The old man let out a dry chuckle. "Hell, I worked for him 40 years. Name's Hank Dawson. I was foreman on the Hartley Ranch from 1984 till about 2 years back when that woman banned me from the property." He said the word woman like it tasted bad. "I live in a trailer about 2 miles up that ridge now." He pointed with his chin toward the hills. "Your daddy told me you might come out here eventually. Did not think it would be under these circumstances, though." He took off his hat, held it against his chest. I am real sorry for your loss, Miss Grace. Your daddy was the finest man I ever knew." Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Here finally was someone who had known her father, someone who was not Victoria, someone who might understand. "Thank you," she said. Hank looked at the cabin, then back at Grace. "She got the ranch, did not she? That woman, and you got this." It was not a question, but Grace nodded anyway. "Yes." Hank made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. He walked up the porch steps, moving carefully around the broken boards like he had done it 100 times before. "Let me help you with that door," he said. "Lock's tricky. You got to lift the handle while you turn." He took the key from Grace's hand. He inserted it into the lock, gripped the old brass handle, and lifted it upward while turning the key. Something inside the mechanism groaned and shifted. The bolt slid back with a metallic shriek. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed like dying things. "Be careful where you step," Hank warned. "Floorboards are soft in some places." Grace stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Dust and mildew and old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood. It was dark. The boarded windows let in only thin lines of light. Grace pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a room that looked like it had been abandoned mid-life. Furniture sat under white sheets, ghost shapes in the gloom. A fireplace took up most of the far wall, black with old soot. Above it hung an oil painting, or what had been an oil painting. Water damage had streaked across the canvas in long, dark lines. Grace stepped closer and saw that the painting was of two people, a man and a woman, standing in front of this very cabin. The woman was young and smiling. The man had his arm around her shoulders. Grace's breath caught. The woman was her mother. The man was her father, 40 years younger, with dark hair and a grin that could light up a room. She touched the frame. Her fingers came away dusty. She looked at the water damage and thought how it looked like the painting was crying. "Generators out back," Hank said from the doorway. "I kept it gassed up like your daddy asked. He paid me to check on this place every month, said keep it ready for Grace. I will go fire it up." While Hank went around the side of the cabin, Grace walked deeper into the room. The floor creaked under her boots. She could see mouse droppings in the corners, spider webs thick as curtains hanging from the ceiling beams. There was a couch against one wall, a wooden table with two chairs, a cast iron stove that probably had not been lit in decades. Everything was covered in dust thick enough to write your name in. Suddenly the lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the old light fixture in the ceiling buzzed to life, casting a dim yellow glow across the room. The generator outside coughed and rumbled. Grace heard Hank's boots on the porch, and then he was standing in the doorway, wiping grease off his hands with a red rag. "That should hold for a few hours," he said. Now that there was light, Grace could see the room more clearly, and that was when she saw it. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, sitting on a surface that was otherwise covered in half an inch of dust, was a single object, a red envelope. It was the only clean thing in the entire cabin. Grace walked over to it. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her name was written on the envelope in blocky handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. Her father's handwriting. She picked it up with shaking hands. She tore it open. Inside was an index card and something small and heavy that fell into her palm, an old brass compass. She turned it over. Engraved on the back were initials and a date. SH 1954. Sarah Hartley, her mother's maiden name. 1954 would have been the year her mother was born. Grace unfolded the index card. The message was short, written in her father's hand. "Gracie," it said, "Victoria sees the surface. You see the soul. This cabin looks worthless because I needed it to look worthless. If you sold it immediately, you would have got nothing. But you are reading this, which means you came inside. You looked closer. The compass points true north, but true north is not a direction. It is beneath your feet. Look down, Gracie. Really look. It was signed Dad. Grace read the note 3 times. She turned the compass over in her hand. The needle swung and settled, pointing toward what she assumed was magnetic north. Look down. What did that mean? Hank was watching her from across the room. He did not ask what the note said. He just waited. Grace looked at her feet. She was standing on a filthy Persian rug, the kind that had probably been expensive 50 years ago but was now moth-eaten and stained. She knelt down. She grabbed one corner of the rug and pulled. It was heavier than it looked, thick with dust and accumulated grime. She pulled harder. The rug moved. Underneath, the floorboards were different. The rest of the cabin floor was made of long vertical planks, rough-cut pine that ran parallel to the walls. But here, under the rug, the boards were arranged in a herringbone pattern, carefully fitted together like a puzzle. And right in the center, one board had a small circular depression cut into it. Not a knot hole, not damage. A perfectly round indentation, just wide enough for a finger. Grace looked up at Hank. He had moved closer, and he was staring at the floor with an expression of pure astonishment. "What in the Sam Hill?" he whispered. Grace hooked her finger into the hole. She pulled. Nothing. She pushed down. Nothing. She tried wiggling it side to side, and then she remembered her father and his love of puzzles, and she tried twisting. The board clicked. It was a tiny sound, barely audible, but Grace felt it through her finger, felt something catch and engage. Then there was a much louder sound, a deep mechanical thunk that echoed up through the floor like the sound of a lock opening in a bank vault. Slowly, a section of the floor began to rise. It was not one board. It was a 3-foot square section, all the herringbone boards moving together as a single piece, lifting on hinges she could not see. Hydraulic hisses accompanied the motion. The section rose about 6 inches and then stopped, tilted open like a trapdoor. Beneath it was darkness, a square shaft descending straight down into the earth. A metal ladder was bolted to one concrete wall, disappearing into the black. Grace scrambled backward. She looked at Hank. He was staring into the opening with his mouth slightly open. "Holy hell," he said softly. "Will, you sly old dog." Grace got to her feet. She walked to the edge of the opening and shone her phone light down. The beam reached maybe 10 feet before it was swallowed by darkness. She could not see the bottom, but the air coming up from the shaft was not musty or damp. It was cool and dry, and she could hear a faint hum, like machinery running somewhere far below. "What is this?" she whispered. "I reckon," Hank said, stepping up beside her, "that is what your daddy wanted you to find." Grace looked at the ladder. It was old but solid, the rungs clean of rust. Someone had been maintaining this. Someone had been coming down here. "I am going down," she said. Hank looked at her. "You sure about that?" Grace thought about Victoria's laugh. She thought about Kyle's smirk. She thought about $60 million in ranch land and cattle and a mansion on a hill. She thought about her father's note. "Look down. Really look." "I am sure," she said. She put her phone in her back pocket. She turned around and found the first rung with her boot. The metal was cold even through the sole. She gripped the ladder with both hands. She looked up at Hank one more time. "I will keep watch," he said. "Holler if you need help." Grace started to climb down. 1 rung, 2, 3. The square of light above her head grew smaller. 4 rungs, 5. The air grew cooler. 6, 7, 8. The light was a distant thing now, like looking up from the bottom of a well. 9, 10. The hum was louder, a steady mechanical rhythm that she could feel in her bones. 15 rungs, 20. How deep did this go? 25, 30. Her boot touched concrete. She had reached the bottom. Grace pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight again. She was standing in a small concrete chamber, maybe 8 feet square. The walls were smooth, poured concrete, not the rough stone she had expected. To her right, set into the wall at shoulder height, was a large industrial switch, the kind you see in old factories with a heavy metal handle. She reached out and flipped it. There was a deep thrumming sound, like a generator kicking on, and then, one by one, fluorescent lights began to flicker to life overhead. They ran down a hallway she had not been able to see in the dark, receding into the distance. As each light came on, it revealed more of the space, and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. She was not standing in a root cellar. She was not standing in a storm shelter. She was standing at the entrance to a vault. The hallway opened into a massive room, easily 1,000 square feet, with reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling high enough that she could not touch it even if she jumped. The air was cool and dry and perfectly still, humming with the sound of what she now recognized as a ventilation system. The fluorescent lights bathed everything in a clean white glow. Along the left wall were floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units, the industrial kind you see in warehouses, and on those shelves were rows and rows of heavy plastic storage bins, each one sealed and labeled. Along the right wall were metal filing cabinets, dozens of them, gray and identical. And in the center of the room, positioned like a command post, was a glass and steel desk. On the desk were 3 computer monitors, all dark. Next to the monitors was a leather notebook. Next to the notebook was a small silver USB drive, and propped against the monitors was a framed photograph. Grace walked toward the desk in a daze. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space. She reached the desk and picked up the photograph. It showed her at 5 years old, sitting on her father's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She remembered the day the photo was taken. They had been at a 4th of July picnic. He had bought her an ice cream cone, and she had dropped it, and instead of being mad, he had laughed and bought her another one. She set the photo down carefully. She looked at the shelving units. She walked over and opened the nearest plastic bin. Inside, packed in vacuum-sealed bricks, were stacks of $100 bills, bank-wrapped. She pulled one out and stared at it. $10,000, the wrapper said. She looked back at the bin. There had to be 50 bricks in there. She opened the next bin. More cash. The next one. Gold bars wrapped in protective cloth. The next one. Jewelry. Rings and necklaces and bracelets, some of which she recognized. Her mother's sapphire necklace. Her grandmother's diamond bracelet. Pieces that Victoria had claimed were lost during a move. Grace walked down the line of shelves, opening bins at random. Cash, bonds, stock certificates, silver coins, more gold, more jewelry. Each bin she opened revealed another layer of wealth that should not exist, that made no sense, that turned everything she thought she knew about her father's death completely upside down. She stopped in the middle of the room. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The vault, the ventilation system, the organized rows of evidence and money, the computer setup. This was not something you built in a week. This was not something you did on a whim. This was years of planning, years of work, years of secrets. Grace walked back to the desk. She sat down in the ergonomic chair. She picked up the silver USB drive. She looked at the dark computer screens, and then she plugged the drive into the tower sitting under the desk. The monitors hummed to life. No password screen appeared, no login required, just a simple desktop with a single folder labeled for Grace. She double-clicked it. Inside was one file, a video file. She clicked it. The video player opened, and there, filling the center monitor, was her father. He was sitting at this very desk in this very room. He looked thin, pale, sick, but his eyes were bright and clear and burning with something that looked like righteous anger. He spoke. His voice came through speakers she had not seen, and Grace felt her hands start to shake. "Gracie girl," he said, "if you are watching this, then the vultures picked my bones clean. I am sorry I could not tell you in person. I could not risk them finding out." Grace put her hand over her mouth. She felt tears start to spill down her cheeks. On the screen, her father leaned forward, and he began to tell her everything. He began to tell her about the woman who had married him, and how she was not a woman at all, how she was a predator, how she had been planning his death from the very beginning, how he had discovered it too late to stop the marriage but not too late to fight back, how he had spent 3 years moving every asset he owned down here, into this vault, into this fortress of concrete and steel hidden beneath a cabin that everyone thought was worthless. He told her about the cash, $48 million, every penny he could liquidate without Victoria noticing. Every stock sale, every cattle deal, every piece of equipment quietly converted to currency and moved underground. He told her about the files in the cabinets, evidence of fraud, evidence of bigamy, evidence of crimes going back 20 years. He told her about the plan, how he had left Victoria nothing but debt disguised as wealth, how the ranch she inherited was mortgaged to the breaking point, how the balloon payment would come due in 45 days and she would not be able to pay it, how everything she thought she had won would evaporate like morning dew. He told Grace that she had the real inheritance, not the cabin, not the 120 acres, the vault, the evidence, the leverage, and most importantly, the truth. The video was 18 minutes long. When it ended, the screen went black. Grace sat in the silent vault and stared at her own reflection in the dark monitor. Her father had not abandoned her. He had not hated her. He had done the opposite. He had given her everything. She stood up. She walked to the filing cabinets. She opened the first drawer. Inside were folders, dozens of them, each one labeled and organized with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She pulled out the first folder. It was labeled Victoria Kane, bigamy. Inside was a marriage certificate from Reno, Nevada, dated 1998. Victoria Kane and Russell Kane. No divorce decree, no annulment, nothing. Just a marriage that had never been dissolved, followed by another marriage to William Hartley 21 years later. Grace opened another folder, property fraud. Inside were surveys, deeds, documents showing how Victoria had used a fraudulent surveyor to move thousands of acres from Grace's inheritance into Victoria's control. Another folder, financial crimes, another, criminal history, another, the plan. Grace did not know how long she sat there, reading through her father's careful documentation of the woman who had stolen 3 years of his life. She did not know what time it was when she finally climbed back up that ladder with $10,000 in cash stuffed into her pockets and the silver USB drive clenched in her fist. She did not know anything except that she was no longer the girl who had stood at a funeral and wondered why her father had hated her. She was the daughter who had just inherited a war chest. Hank was still waiting when she emerged from the shaft. He looked at her face and at the money visible in her jacket pocket, and he did not ask questions. He just said, "You find what you needed." Grace looked at him. She thought about Victoria in her Chanel suit. She thought about Kyle with his gold toothpick. She thought about the way they had laughed at her in that conference room. She thought about $60 million in ranch land that was really $60 million in debt. "Yes," she said, "I found everything." "What are you going to do?" Grace looked at the cabin around her, the rotting walls, the broken porch, the condemned notice on the door. She looked at the floor where the trapdoor sat, closed again and hidden beneath the rug. She looked at Hank, this old cowboy who had been loyal to her father for 40 years and had been cast aside by Victoria like he was nothing. "I am going to need your help," she said, "and I am going to need a lawyer, someone Victoria has not bought." Hank smiled. It was a hard smile, the kind that said he knew exactly what was coming and he was ready for it. "I know just the person," he said. "Woman named Frances Blackwood. Got disbarred in Colorado for punching a lawyer in a land rights case. Practices here in Wyoming now. Specializes in fraud. Hates bullies." "Perfect," Grace said. Hank pulled out his phone. He made the call. While he talked, Grace walked back to the mantelpiece and looked at the painting of her parents. She touched her mother's face through the water damage. She thought about the compass in her pocket, the one with her mother's initials. She thought about her father's voice on that video, telling her to give them hell. And Grace smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that the game was not over. It was the smile of someone who had been left for dead and had just climbed out of the grave with a weapon in each hand. Victoria thought she had won. Victoria thought the war was over. But the war had not even started yet. Grace spent that first night in the vault. She did not mean to. She had climbed back up the ladder intending to leave, intending to drive back to her apartment and process everything she had discovered. But when she reached the top and looked around the dark cabin with Hank standing there asking if she was all right, she realized she could not leave. Not yet. There was too much down there, too much she needed to understand. Hank brought her a sleeping bag from his trailer. He brought bottled water and beef jerky and a thermos of coffee that was still hot. He asked if she wanted him to stay, and she said no, she needed to do this alone. He understood. He gave her his cell phone number, told her to call if anything happened, told her the nearest sheriff's station was 40 minutes away in Lander. Then he drove off in his pickup truck, and Grace was alone with a cabin full of ghosts and a vault full of secrets. She went back down the ladder. This time she brought the sleeping bag and the food and a sense of purpose that felt almost like armor. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady song. The ventilation system breathed cool air through invisible vents. Grace walked to the first shelving unit and began to count. The plastic storage bins were organized with military precision. Each one was labeled with a number and a code. Bin 1 through bin 40 contained cash. She opened every single one. Inside each bin were 50 vacuum-sealed bricks of $100 bills. Each brick contained 100 bills, $10,000 per brick, 50 bricks per bin, $500,000 per bin, 40 bins total. Grace did the math 3 times because she could not believe it. $20 million in cash, just sitting there, preserved and protected and waiting. But that was only the first 4 shelving units. The next section contained something different. She opened bin 41 and found herself staring at gold bars, not the small ones you see in movies. These were 1-kilogram bars about the size of a brick, wrapped in soft cloth to prevent scratching. Each one had to weigh more than 2 pounds. She pulled one out and felt the weight of it, the density, the way it seemed to concentrate wealth into something you could hold in your hands. There were 80 gold bars. At current market prices, she knew gold traded around $60,000 per kilogram. 80 bars meant close to $5 million in gold. She set the bar back carefully and closed the bin. The next bins contained silver coins, Morgan dollars mostly, with dates going back to the 1880s. Rare dates, mint condition. Her father had been collecting these for years, she remembered. He used to show them to her when she was young, explaining the history behind each one, why a certain year was valuable, what made a coin special. She had thought Victoria sold them all. Apparently she had been wrong. Bin 55 contained jewelry, and this was where Grace had to sit down on the concrete floor and take several deep breaths. Inside were pieces she recognized. Her mother's sapphire necklace, the one her father had given her for their 10th anniversary. Her grandmother's diamond tennis bracelet. Her great-grandmother's pearl earrings. A man's gold watch that had belonged to her grandfather. All the family heirlooms that Victoria had claimed were lost during one move or another. All of them here. Preserved, protected, waiting to come home. Grace held the sapphire necklace up to the light. The stones caught the fluorescent glow and threw blue fire across the concrete walls. She remembered her mother wearing this, remembered the way it looked against her skin, remembered her mother laughing at some joke her father had made, the necklace catching the light just like this. She put it on. It was cold at first, then warm. It felt like coming home. The last section of bins contained documents, bearer bonds mostly, government bonds that paid to whoever held them, no name attached, no registration required. They were from the 1990s, issued when interest rates were high and they had matured years ago. Grace counted them carefully. $10 million worth, just waiting to be cashed. There were also stock certificates. Physical stock certificates, the kind companies stopped issuing 20 years ago when everything went digital. Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. Her father had bought these in the early days before the companies became giants, and he had never transferred them to digital format. They were still valid, still worth whatever the market said they were worth. Grace pulled out her phone and did a quick search. The Microsoft certificates alone were worth close to $3 million. The Apple stock was worth another $4 million. Amazon was worth nearly $2 million more. She sat in the middle of the vault and stared at the shelves around her. $20 million in cash, $5 million in gold, $2 million in silver, $3 million in jewelry, $10 million in bonds, $9 million in stocks. She added it up in her head. $49 million. Her father had liquidated nearly $50 million in assets and hidden them underground in a vault beneath a cabin that everyone thought was worthless. Victoria had inherited $60 million in ranch land and cattle and equipment, but Grace was willing to bet that not all of that $60 million was real. Her father's video had mentioned debt, mortgages. He had said Victoria would not be able to pay, which meant the ranch she thought she owned was probably leveraged to the breaking point. Grace stood up. She walked to the filing cabinets. There were 12 of them, each one 5 drawers tall, each drawer packed with manila folders. She opened the first drawer of the first cabinet. The label on the front said, Victoria Kane, Personal History. Inside were folders organized by year, going back to 1997. Grace pulled out the first one. It contained newspaper clippings from Reno, Nevada. A small article about a woman named Victoria Kane who had been questioned in connection with an insurance fraud case. No charges filed. Another article about a man named Marcus Dawson who had died under suspicious circumstances, leaving his estate to his widow, Victoria Kane. A third article about how Victoria Kane had sold the estate and moved to Montana. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. She pulled out the next folder. Montana, 1999 through 2002. More articles, more dead men, more estates sold and widows disappearing. The pattern was unmistakable. Victoria was not just a gold digger. She was a professional. The next drawer contained information about Russell Kane. Grace pulled out a thick folder and found a marriage certificate from Las Vegas, dated June 1998. Victoria Kane and Russell Kane. There were photos of them together, taken by what looked like a private investigator. Photos from 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. Recent photos. Victoria and Russell meeting in motels, getting into cars together, sitting in restaurants. They were still together, still married, which meant her marriage to William Heartland had been bigamy. Grace pulled out her phone and took pictures of everything. The marriage certificate, the photos, the newspaper articles. She did not know what she would do with them yet, but she knew she needed evidence. Real evidence. The kind that would stand up in court. The next cabinet was labeled Property Fraud. Grace opened it and found surveys, official-looking documents with county seals and surveyor's stamps. But when she compared the surveys from 2018 to the ones from 2022, she saw the boundaries had changed dramatically. The original deed from 1985 showed that when William Hartley married Sarah Miller, the property had been structured carefully. Sarah had brought 12,000 acres to the marriage, land her family had owned for generations. This land, which included the foreman's cabin and the surrounding territory, had been held in a family trust with Sarah as the primary beneficiary and Grace as the successor upon Sarah's death. William had owned a separate 3,000-acre parcel where he had built the main ranch house and developed the primary cattle operation. Together, the properties totaled 15,000 acres, but they were legally distinct. When Sarah died in 2006, her 12,000 acres should have transferred directly to Grace through the trust structure, but they had not. Grace found the fraudulent documents. In 2022, Victoria had hired a surveyor, actually Russell Kane operating under fake credentials, to conduct a boundary review. The fraudulent survey had redrawn the property lines entirely. It claimed that the original trust documents contained errors, that Sarah's 12,000 acres had actually been only 120 acres surrounding the cabin, and that the remaining land, nearly 12,000 acres of prime grazing territory, had always been part of William's ranch operation. The fraud was sophisticated. Russell had forged William's signature on documents that appeared to correct the supposed historical error. He had created shell companies in Victoria's name and transferred the disputed acreage into those entities. On paper, it looked like a legitimate clarification of confusing property records. In reality, it was theft. Victoria had stolen Grace's entire inheritance from her mother, leaving her with a worthless cabin and 120 acres of rocks while claiming nearly 12,000 acres of valuable land for herself. Grace took more photos. She made notes on her phone about which folders contained which evidence. She worked methodically, moving from cabinet to cabinet, documenting everything: financial crimes, money laundering, fraud, conspiracy. Her father had spent 3 years building a case that would destroy Victoria in court, and he had done it so carefully, so thoroughly, that there was no way she could escape. But the last filing cabinet was different. It was labeled Medical Records and Timeline. Grace opened it with shaking hands. Inside were her father's medical files going back 10 years. Annual checkups, blood work, EKGs, everything normal, everything healthy, until the last folder. The last folder was dated 3 weeks before his death. It contained a letter from her father to his doctor asking for a full cognitive assessment. The doctor's report was attached. William Hartley, it said, showed no signs of dementia, confusion, or cognitive decline. He was alert, oriented, and fully capable of managing his own affairs. The doctor had noted that Will specifically requested this assessment be documented and notarized because, and Grace read the words twice to make sure she understood them, because he feared someone might try to claim he was not of sound mind after his death. Her father had known. He had known Victoria would challenge the will. He had known she would try to claim he was senile or confused or manipulated. And he had protected himself, protected Grace, by getting everything documented while he was still alive. But there was something else in the folder, a medical report from the county coroner. Grace pulled it out and read it with growing horror. The official cause of death was listed as myocardial infarction, heart attack, but there was a note at the bottom, written in pen, that said, "No history of heart disease, sudden onset, unusual presentation." And below that, in her father's handwriting, were 2 words, "toxicology pending." Grace stared at those words. Her father had written them before he died, which meant he had suspected something. He had suspected that if he died suddenly, it might not be natural. He had suspected Victoria might try to kill him. She put the folder down carefully. Her hands were shaking. She walked to the desk in the center of the vault and sat down in the chair where her father had recorded his video. She looked at the monitors, dark now, and she thought about him sitting here, sick and dying, planning his revenge. She picked up the leather notebook that sat next to the monitors. It was his journal. She opened it to the first page. The entries went back 3 years, to the month after he married Victoria. March 2021. Noticed Victoria going through my files. Caught her on the phone with someone discussing property values. Started to suspect. April 2021. Hired private investigator. Preliminary report shows she is still married to Russell Kane. This marriage is void. June 2021. Discovered fraudulent surveys. She is not just stealing from me. She is stealing from Grace, from my daughter, from Sarah's legacy. The 12,000 acres that should belong to Grace through her mother's trust. I cannot let this stand. August 2021. Started liquidating assets, moving everything I can into untraceable accounts, building the vault. This will take time. The entries continued, month after month, documenting his growing suspicion, his careful planning, his systematic dismantling of his own empire so Victoria could not have it. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before his death. February 2024. Feeling weaker, heart problems. She is putting something in my food. I am certain of it now. I cannot prove it. I cannot go to police without exposing everything and giving her time to run. The plan must proceed. The vault is ready. Grace will find it. Grace will finish this. I only hope I can hold on long enough to see her one more time, but Victoria will not allow it. She has made sure of that. This is goodbye then. Goodbye, Gracie girl. I love you. Make them pay. Grace closed the notebook. She put her head down on the desk and cried, not the angry tears from before, deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere she did not know existed. Her father had not just died. He had been murdered, slowly, deliberately, and he had known it was happening, and he had used the time he had left to protect her. She did not know how long she cried. When she finally lifted her head, the vault was still humming its mechanical song, and the lights were still burning steady and bright, and nothing had changed except that she now understood the full weight of what her father had done. He had given her a weapon. He had given her evidence. He had given her $50 million and the truth. Now it was her job to use it. Grace wiped her face with her sleeve. She stood up. She walked back to the ladder and climbed up to the cabin. The sun was rising outside, pale light coming through the gaps in the boarded windows. Hank was sitting on the porch, drinking coffee from a thermos, his rifle across his lap. "You stayed all night," he said when she emerged from the trapdoor. "I had a lot to process," Grace said. She closed the hidden door and pulled the rug back over it. Her knees were shaking. Her whole body felt wrung out like she had run a marathon. Hank poured her a cup of coffee from his thermos. She took it and sat down on the dusty floor next to him. They drank in silence for a while, watching the sun climb over the eastern hills. Finally, Hank said, "Your daddy told me something once, about 2 years ago. We were standing right here on this porch, and he was looking out at the land, and he said, 'Hank, if anything happens to me, make sure Grace comes here. Make sure she looks under the rug.' I asked him what he meant. He just smiled and said, 'She will understand when the time comes.'" Grace looked at the old cowboy. He had been loyal to her father for 40 years. He had been cast out by Victoria, and still he had stayed, watching over this cabin, waiting for Grace. She made a decision. "Hank," she said, "I need to tell you something, and then I need your help." She told him everything, about the vault, about the money, about the evidence, about her father's journal and the suspicion of murder. Hank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That woman is a snake. I knew it the day I met her. Your daddy was a smart man, but he was lonely after your mama passed. Victoria knew how to play that." "Do you think he was right?" Grace asked. Do you think she killed him? Hank looked out at the sunrise. I think your daddy was the healthiest 68-year-old man I ever knew. I think he could have lived another 20 years. And I think he died 2 months after he finished this vault. He nodded toward the cabin. That is one hell of a coincidence. Grace felt the anger building in her chest again, hot and fierce. What do I do? You call that lawyer I told you about, Hank said. Frances Blackwood. You show her what you got, and you let her tell you how to make it hurt. Grace pulled out her phone. She had taken Hank's advice last night and saved Frances Blackwood's number. She hesitated for just a moment, and then she dialed. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. This is Frances. Miss Blackwood, Grace said. My name is Grace Hartley. Hank Dawson gave me your number. I need a lawyer. I need someone who is not afraid of a fight. There was a pause, then Frances said, Hartley. William Hartley's daughter, I heard about his passing. I am sorry for your loss. Thank you, Grace said, but I did not call for condolences. I called because I think my stepmother killed my father and I need help proving it. Another pause, longer this time. Then Frances said, Where are you right now? Mile marker 47, the old foreman's cabin. Stay there, Frances said. I will be there in 2 hours. Do not talk to anyone. Do not call anyone. And for God's sake, do not go near your stepmother. I will not, Grace promised. Good, Frances said, and hung up. Grace looked at Hank. She is coming. Then we wait, Hank said. They did not have to wait long for trouble to find them. About an hour after Grace called Frances, they heard the sound of an engine coming up the 2-track road. Hank stood and picked up his rifle, not aiming it but holding it ready. Grace stood beside him. A yellow Porsche Cayenne came over the ridge, moving too fast for the rough road, bottoming out on rocks with expensive-sounding scrapes. It skidded to a stop in front of the cabin, spraying gravel. Kyle Kane got out. He was wearing designer sunglasses and a white linen shirt that already had dust on it. He looked at the cabin with obvious disgust, then he looked at Grace and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Gracie, he called out like they were old friends. Look at you playing homesteader. This is adorable. What do you want, Kyle? Grace asked. She stayed on the porch. She kept her voice level. Kyle walked closer. He put his hands in his pockets, casual, like he owned the place. Mom sent me. She feels bad about how things went down at the lawyer's office. She wants to make it right. Make it right, Grace repeated. Yeah, Kyle pulled out a folded piece of paper from his back pocket. This is a quitclaim deed. Sign it, and we will give you $75,000 cash. You can get a nice apartment in town, buy a new car, start fresh. Mom thinks it is the fair thing to do. Grace almost laughed. The fair thing would be giving me back my father, she said. But since that is not possible, tell your mother I am not selling. Kyle's smile faded. Come on, Gracie, be reasonable. What are you going to do with this land? It is worthless. You cannot even graze cattle on it. Rocky soil, no water, no access. You are just going to end up paying taxes on a pile of nothing. Then it should not matter to your mother whether I keep it or not, Grace said. Kyle took off his sunglasses. His eyes were cold. She wants it, he said, and what Mom wants she gets. You should know that by now. Grace felt Hank shift beside her. She put a hand on his arm, gentle, telling him to wait. She looked at Kyle and said, Tell your mother the land is not for sale. Not for 75,000. Not for 75 million. Tell her I am keeping it. And tell her to stay off my property. Kyle's face went red. You are making a mistake, he said. Mom is trying to help you. You turn her down, you are on your own, no family support, no nothing. I have been on my own for 3 years, Grace said. Since your mother locked me out of the ranch, I think I can manage. Kyle stepped closer to the porch. His voice dropped lower, threatening. "You do not know who you are messing with. Mom has friends, important friends, judges, lawyers, people who can make your life very difficult." "Is that a threat?" Grace asked. "It is friendly advice," Kyle said. "Take the money, walk away, while you still can." Hank raised the rifle, not pointing it at Kyle, just raising it so it was visible. "I think the lady said no," Hank said quietly. "I think it is time for you to leave." Kyle looked at the rifle, then at Hank, then at Grace. He backed up a step. "You will regret this," he said. He pointed at Grace. "You will wish you took the deal." He got back in his Porsche and slammed the door. He reversed hard, spinning the tires, and then he was racing back down the two-track road, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the morning air. Grace waited until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then she said, "That went well." Hank lowered the rifle. "He is scared," he said. "They both are. They would not be making offers if they did not need this land for something." Grace thought about the files in the vault, the property fraud, the fake surveys. Victoria had stolen nearly 12,000 acres from Grace's inheritance, land that should have come to her through her mother's family trust. But what if there was more to it? What if this specific piece of land, this seemingly worthless 120 acres that Grace had been left, was important for some reason she did not understand yet? She made a mental note to look through the property files more carefully. There was something here. Something Victoria wanted badly enough to send Kyle with threats disguised as friendly offers. Whatever it was, Grace intended to find out. Frances Blackwood arrived exactly 2 hours after her phone call, driving a dusty Ford F-150 that looked like it had seen better days. She got out, and Grace's first impression was of someone who did not waste time on appearances. Frances was 58 years old, with silver-gray hair pulled back in a long braid. She wore jeans and a denim jacket and turquoise jewelry that looked handmade. Her face was weathered from sun and wind, and her eyes were sharp and calculating. "You must be Grace," she said, walking up to the porch without waiting for an invitation. "Hank, good to see you again." "Frances," Hank said, tipping his hat. Frances looked at the cabin, then at Grace. "So," she said, "you think your stepmother killed your father. Tell me why." Grace told her. She told her about the vault, about the evidence, about the journal entry where her father wrote that he thought he was being poisoned. She told her about the medical records, about the cognitive assessment, about the note saying toxicology pending. She told her about the bigamy, the fraud, the pattern of dead men stretching back 25 years. She told her about the property fraud, about how Victoria had stolen not just 8,000 acres, but nearly 12,000 acres total, the entire inheritance that should have come to Grace through her mother's family trust. Frances listened without interrupting. When Grace finished, Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." Grace led her into the cabin. She pulled back the rug and opened the trapdoor. Frances looked down the shaft and whistled low. "Well," she said, "that is not something you see every day." They climbed down together. When Frances reached the bottom and saw the vault, she stopped and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The shelves, the bins, the filing cabinets, the desk. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, "your father was not messing around." Grace showed her the cash, the gold, the jewelry, the bonds, the stocks. Frances did quick math in her head, and Grace saw her eyes widen when she reached the total. Then Grace showed her the files, the bigamy evidence, the property fraud, the criminal history. Frances read through everything with the focused intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "This is airtight," Frances said finally. She held up the marriage certificate between Victoria and Russell Kane. "This alone invalidates her marriage to your father. Everything she inherited is void. The will left everything to his wife, but she was never legally his wife." "Can we prove it?" Grace asked. We can prove all of it, Francis said, but we need to be smart. If we go after her too fast, she will run. We need to lock her in place first. How? Francis thought for a moment. Then she said, we file a quiet title action on this property. We claim that the surveys were fraudulent and that you are the rightful owner of the full 12,000 acres that should have come to you through your mother's trust. We make it public. We get it on the court record. That will freeze any property transfers. She will not be able to sell or mortgage anything until the case is resolved. And that will keep her here, Grace said. That will keep her here, Francis confirmed. And while we are fighting the property case, we gather more evidence. We get depositions. We subpoena records. And when we have everything we need, we hit her with the criminal charges: bigamy, fraud, and if we can prove it, murder. Grace felt something like hope for the first time since the funeral. Can you do this? She asked. Francis smiled. It was a hard smile, the kind that said she had been in fights before and knew how to win them. Honey, she said, I have been waiting my whole career for a case like this. A clear-cut fraud with a victim who has the resources to fight back. A black widow who got sloppy. This is not just a case. This is a career highlight. So yes, I can do this. The question is, are you ready for what comes next? What comes next? Grace asked. War, Francis said. She will come at you with everything she has. Lawyers. Intimidation. She will try to drag your name through the mud. She will make you look like a greedy daughter who is lying about a grieving widow. It will get ugly. Grace thought about her father's journal. She thought about him sitting in this vault, dying, writing those last words. Make them pay. She looked at Francis and said, I am ready. Good, Francis said. Then let us get to work. They spent the next 3 hours in the vault. Francis took photos of everything. She made lists of documents they would need. She outlined a legal strategy that was aggressive and methodical and designed to back Victoria into a corner she could not escape. Grace watched the lawyer work and felt something that had been broken inside her start to knit back together. She was not alone anymore. She had an ally. She had a plan. When they finally climbed back up to the cabin, the sun was high overhead, and Grace realized she had not eaten in almost 24 hours. Hank had brought sandwiches and more coffee. They sat on the porch and ate and talked about next steps. First thing, Francis said, we get your father's body exhumed for a proper toxicology screen. The coroner's report said pending, which means it was never done. We petitioned the court for exhumation based on suspicious circumstances. Will they allow it? Grace asked. With the evidence you have showing his suspicion of poisoning, yes. A judge will grant it. It might take a few weeks, but we will get it. And if the toxicology comes back positive? Then we have murder, Francis said, and everything else becomes secondary. She will go to prison for the rest of her life. Grace took a bite of her sandwich. It tasted like sawdust, but she forced herself to eat. What about the property case? We file that tomorrow, Francis said. I will need copies of the fraudulent surveys and the original deeds, including the trust documents showing that your mother's 12,000 acres should have transferred to you. We will file in district court, ask for immediate injunction preventing any property transfers. That should freeze her assets within 48 hours. She will know I am coming for her, Grace said. Let her know, Francis said. Let her panic. Panicked people make mistakes, and we will be watching for every single one. Hank spoke up. What about Kyle? He came here this morning making threats. Francis looked interested. What kind of threats? Grace told her about the quitclaim deed, the offer, the veiled intimidation. Francis made notes on her phone. That is witness intimidation, she said. If he comes back, record it. Every word. We can use that. The sun was starting to drop toward the western hills when Francis finally stood to leave. She shook Grace's hand. You did good, she said, finding all this. keeping your head. A lot of people would have crumbled. I had good motivation, Grace said. Francis looked at the cabin, at the surrounding land, at the mountains in the distance. Your father knew what he was doing. This land looks worthless to everyone else, but it is the most valuable piece of ground in Wyoming, not because of what is on it, because of what is under it. Grace thought about the vault, about $50 million in cash and gold and evidence, about the weapon her father had forged for her in the darkness beneath a cabin everyone thought was condemned. Francis was right. This land was priceless. I will call you tomorrow, Francis said. She got in her truck and drove away, leaving Grace and Hank alone again. They stood on the porch and watched the sun set. The sky turned orange, then pink, then purple. The first stars appeared. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Hank finished his coffee and said, "You should go back to town tonight. Get some rest. This is going to be a long fight." Grace thought about her apartment above the hardware store, the small rooms, the thin walls, the neighbors who would ask questions. She thought about the vault beneath her feet, about her father's journal, about everything he had built for her. She shook her head. "I am staying here," she said. Here, Hank looked at the cabin. There is no bed, no running water. The generator only has a few hours of fuel left. "I will manage," Grace said. "This is my land, my home. I am not leaving it." Hank studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right. I will bring you some supplies tomorrow, sleeping bag, food, more fuel, and I will keep an eye on the road. Make sure Victoria does not send anyone else." "Thank you, Hank." The old cowboy put on his hat. "Your daddy would be proud of you," he said. "You know that, right?" Grace felt tears sting her eyes again. "I hope so," she whispered. Hank drove away in his pickup, and Grace was alone. She went inside the cabin and lit the old oil lamp Hank had left for her. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. She pulled the sleeping bag over to the fireplace and sat down with her back against the stone. She looked at the painting of her parents above the mantel, the water damage that looked like tears. "I found it, Dad," she said to the painting. "I found everything you left for me, and I am going to finish what you started." The painting did not answer, but in the flickering lamplight, Grace could almost see her father smile. She pulled out her phone and opened the photos she had taken of the evidence. Hundreds of them, marriage certificates, surveys, financial records, newspaper articles about dead men and missing widows. A pattern so clear it was almost beautiful in its terrible simplicity. Victoria Kane had been killing wealthy men for 25 years. She had refined it to an art, and she had gotten away with it every single time. Until now. Until William Hartley had figured out what she was and had used the last months of his life to build a trap she could not escape. Grace scrolled to the last photo. It was a page from her father's journal, the final entry, "Make them pay." She read those words again and again until they were burned into her memory. Then she turned off her phone to save the battery. She lay down in the sleeping bag and stared up at the dark ceiling. Somewhere to the south, Victoria was sleeping in an 8,000-square-foot mansion, probably dreaming about all the money she thought she had won. Somewhere nearby, Kyle was probably celebrating with his friends, laughing about how his mother had pulled off the con of a lifetime. They thought it was over. They thought they had gotten away with murder. But they were wrong, because underneath a worthless cabin in a vault nobody knew existed, Grace Hartley had just inherited a war chest. And tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. Grace closed her eyes. She thought about her mother's sapphire necklace, still around her neck, warm against her skin. She thought about her father's compass in her pocket. She thought about $50 million and enough evidence to destroy a killer. And for the first time since the funeral, Grace Hartley smiled in the darkness and knew exactly what she was going to do. She was going to give them hell. The petition for exhumation landed on the district court judge's desk on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, Victoria's lawyers were calling it an abomination. Frances had filed the paperwork herself, walking it through the courthouse in Lander with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from 30 years of legal warfare. The document was 40 pages long, meticulously researched, and devastating in its implications. It cited the pending toxicology notation in the coroner's report. It cited William Hartley's own journal entry expressing concern about poisoning. It cited the suspicious timing of his death, coming just weeks after he had completed a cognitive assessment proving he was of sound mind. It cited the pattern of deaths surrounding Victoria Kane over the previous 25 years. The judge who drew the case was Margaret Stone, a 62-year-old woman who had been on the bench for 25 years and had a reputation for being unmoved by theatrics. She read the petition in her chambers that afternoon, and according to Frances's sources in the courthouse, she read it twice. Then she called both legal teams into her courtroom for an emergency hearing. Grace sat in the gallery, wearing the same black dress she had worn to the funeral. She had washed it, but it still smelled faintly of dust from the cabin. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 lawyers in expensive suits arrayed around her like shields. She had not looked at Grace once. Her face was a mask of dignified grief, carefully constructed, perfectly maintained. She wore pearls and a navy suit, and her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested restraint and sorrow. Judge Stone entered. Everyone stood. The judge sat. Everyone else sat. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system and the quiet scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her stenography machine. "I have read the petition," Judge Stone said. Her voice was flat and professional. "It makes serious allegations. Mrs. Hartley, your response." Victoria's lead attorney stood. A man named Arthur Grimes, 60 years old, silver hair, a voice like silk over steel. "Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt by the decedent's daughter to harass my client during her time of grief. There is no credible evidence of poisoning. The coroner ruled the death natural. This petition is nothing more than speculation and innuendo designed to damage Mrs. Hartley's reputation." Judge Stone looked at Frances, counsel. Frances stood. She did not have the expensive suit or the silver hair. She wore her denim jacket and turquoise jewelry, and she spoke with the kind of plain directness that judges either loved or hated. "Your Honor, the decedent himself wrote in his personal journal that he suspected poisoning. He specifically requested toxicology testing. That test was never performed. We are simply asking that it be done now. If Mrs. Hartley is innocent, the test will show that. If she is guilty, justice demands we know the truth." Judge Stone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The court finds that there are sufficient grounds to warrant further investigation. The petition for exhumation is granted. The body of William Edward Hartley will be exhumed within 7 days, and a full toxicology screen will be performed by the state medical examiner. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down. Victoria made a small sound, quickly stifled. Her lawyers surrounded her, speaking in urgent whispers. Grace sat perfectly still and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. The first shot had been fired. The war was real now. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Frances had tipped them off, a calculated move to put public pressure on Victoria. Grace stood on the courthouse steps and let Frances do the talking. "All we want is the truth," Frances said to the cameras. "William Hartley was a beloved member of this community. He deserves a proper investigation into his death. We believe the evidence will speak for itself." A reporter called out, "Do you think Mrs. Hartley killed her husband?" Frances smiled, cold and sharp. "I think the toxicology report will answer that question." They drove back to the cabin in Frances's truck. Grace was quiet most of the way. Finally she said, How long until we get results? 2 weeks, maybe 3, Francis said. State Crime Lab is backed up, but they will prioritize this given the court order. And if the toxicology comes back positive? Then we have her, Francis said. Murder in the first degree. She will spend the rest of her life in prison. Grace looked out the window at the passing landscape. Brown hills and sage and distant mountains. What if it comes back negative? Then we fight the civil case, Francis said. We prove the bigamy. We prove the fraud. We take back your land and your money. Either way, she loses. It is just a question of how much. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting. Hank was there, sitting on the porch with his rifle and his thermos of coffee. He had brought supplies like he promised. A new sleeping bag, canned food, bottled water, 5 gallons of gasoline for the generator. He had also brought something else, a satellite phone. Cell service is unreliable out here, he said, handing it to Grace. If something happens and you need help fast, use this. It is connected to my number and the sheriff's department. Grace took the phone. Thank you, Hank. How did it go in court? He asked. We got the exhumation order, Francis said. Hank nodded slowly. That woman is going to be angry, he said. Angry people do stupid things. You watch yourself, Miss Grace. I will, Grace promised. Francis left. Hank left. Grace was alone again with the cabin and the vault and the gathering darkness. She ate a can of soup heated on the old wood stove. She sat by the fire and read through more of her father's journals by lamplight. There were details she had missed the first time. Notes about Victoria's spending patterns. Records of mysterious withdrawals from joint accounts. A timeline of his deteriorating health that correlated exactly with when Victoria had started cooking all his meals. The evidence was damning, but Grace wanted the toxicology report. She wanted scientific proof. She wanted something that could not be argued away or dismissed as coincidence. She wanted the truth in black and white. She fell asleep in the sleeping bag by the fireplace and dreamed of her father. In the dream, he was young and healthy, and he was teaching her to fish in a mountain stream. He told her that patience was the most important skill a fisherman could have. Patience and knowing when to set the hook. She woke up before dawn with those words echoing in her head. Patience, and knowing when to set the hook. The exhumation happened on a gray morning exactly 1 week after the court order. Grace was not there. Francis had advised against it. Let the professionals handle it, she had said. You do not need that image in your head. So Grace stayed at the cabin and tried not to think about what was happening in the cemetery in Riverton, about her father's casket being lifted from the ground, about the state medical examiner opening it, about the samples being taken for testing. Instead, she focused on the property case. Francis had filed the quiet title action 3 days after the exhumation hearing. The lawsuit claimed that the surveys conducted in 2022 were fraudulent, that the true boundaries of the foreman's cabin property included 8,000 acres currently claimed by Victoria's shell company, and that Grace Hartley was the rightful owner of said property by inheritance from her mother Sarah Hartley, who had owned the land before her death in 2006. The filing sent shockwaves through the county clerk's office. Grace's land claim, if upheld, would make her one of the largest landowners in Fremont County. It would also completely invalidate Victoria's control over a significant portion of what she thought was the main ranch. Victoria's response was swift and vicious. She filed a counter-suit alleging that Grace was engaged in a malicious campaign of harassment against a grieving widow. She claimed that all surveys had been conducted by licensed professionals and were completely legitimate. She claimed that William Hartley had been of diminished mental capacity in his final years, and that any documents he created during that time were suspect. She claimed that Grace had manipulated her dying father into creating fraudulent evidence to support a baseless land grab. The legal papers flew back and forth like artillery shells. Motions, counter-motions, objections, responses. The court docket grew thicker by the day. And through it all, Grace stayed at the cabin, living in one room with a wood stove and a sleeping bag, guarding the vault beneath her feet like a dragon guarding treasure. But Victoria was not content to fight only in the courtroom. 1 week after the exhumation, Grace woke to the sound of heavy machinery. She pulled on her boots and ran outside to find a yellow bulldozer rumbling up the 2-track road, followed by a black SUV and a white pickup truck with contractor logos on the side. The bulldozer stopped at the edge of her property line. A man in a hard hat got out of the SUV. He was carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of confidence that came from being paid well to do a job and not ask questions. He saw Grace on the porch and walked toward her. "Ma'am," he said, "we have a work order to remove this structure. It has been condemned as a public safety hazard. We are going to need you to vacate the premises." Grace felt her heart start to pound. She pulled out her phone and called Francis. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "They are here," Grace said. "Bulldozer, contractor. They say they are going to knock down the cabin." "Do not let them touch anything," Francis said. "I am filing an emergency injunction right now. Stall them. I will be there in 30 minutes. Grace hung up. She looked at the contractor. "This is my property," she said. "You do not have permission to be here." The contractor checked his clipboard. "We have a work order from the county. Structure is condemned. Presents a danger to public safety. We are authorized to demolish." "Show me the work order," Grace said. The man handed her the clipboard. Grace scanned the document. It was official looking, with county seals and signatures, but the date bothered her. The condemnation notice had been issued 2 years ago. Why was the county suddenly enforcing it now? The answer, of course, was that the county was not enforcing it. Victoria was. She had found some bureaucrat she could bribe or pressure, and she had resurrected a 2-year-old condemnation order specifically to destroy the cabin, to destroy the evidence, to bury the vault before anyone else could find it. Grace handed the clipboard back. "I am calling my lawyer," she said. "You are not touching this building until she gets here." The contractor shrugged. "Lady, I am just doing my job. We have legal authority. You can call whoever you want, but that dozer is going to start working in 5 minutes whether you like it or not." Grace pulled out the satellite phone Hank had given her. She dialed the sheriff's department. She told the dispatcher that men were trespassing on her property with heavy equipment and threatening to destroy her home. The dispatcher said a deputy was 40 minutes away. Grace said that was not fast enough. The dispatcher said it was the best they could do. Grace hung up and looked at the bulldozer. The operator was climbing into the cab. The engine rumbled louder. The blade started to lower. And then a gunshot cracked across the valley. Everyone froze. The bulldozer operator killed the engine. The contractor dove behind the SUV. Grace spun around and saw Hank standing on the ridge above the cabin, his rifle pointed at the sky. He worked the bolt action and fired another round into the air. "Next one will not be a warning," Hank shouted down. "You boys are trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave before the sheriff gets here." The contractor stood up slowly, hands visible. "Now hold on, old-timer," he said. "We do not want any trouble." "Then turn that machine around and get off this land," Hank said. He lowered the rifle to point at the bulldozer, not at the operator, at the machine itself. One shot through the radiator would disable it completely. The contractor looked at Grace, then at Hank, then at the bulldozer. He made a calculation. Whatever Victoria was paying him, it was not enough to get shot over. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Grace could not hear the conversation, but she saw his face get red. He listened for a moment, argued, listened more, then hung up. "We are leaving," he said, "but you will be hearing from our lawyers." "Looking forward to it," Grace said. The bulldozer operator climbed down from the cab. The trucks turned around with difficulty on the narrow road. They drove away, leaving deep ruts in the soft earth. Grace waited until they were completely out of sight before her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. Hank came down from the ridge, moving carefully on the steep slope. When he reached the cabin, he sat down next to her. "You okay?" Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. After a moment she said, "Thank you." "Your daddy would have done the same for me," Hank said. He ejected the remaining rounds from the rifle and put them in his pocket. "Besides, I did not like the look of that fellow with the clipboard. Too clean. The kind of man who has never done a day of honest work in his life." Frances arrived 20 minutes later, driving like she was on fire. She got out of her truck with a sheaf of papers in her hand. "I got the emergency injunction," she said. "Judge Stone signed it 15 minutes ago. No demolition of any structures on this property pending resolution of the title dispute." She looked at the tire ruts in the road. "What happened?" Grace told her. Frances's expression went from concern to furious. "Witness intimidation," she said, "destruction of evidence, abuse of county authority." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of everything. The tire tracks, the disturbed earth, the work order the contractor had left behind. "This is a gift," she said. "Every time Victoria does something like this, she makes our case stronger." "Will she stop?" Grace asked. Frances looked at her. "Not until we make her. These people have been getting away with this for 25 years. They think they are untouchable. We need to show them they are not." The next development came 3 days later. Frances called Grace on the satellite phone with news that made her stomach drop. "We have a problem," Frances said. "Victoria filed a motion to have your father's cognitive assessment thrown out. She found a doctor willing to testify that the assessment was coerced, that your father was suffering from early-stage dementia, and that any legal documents he created in the final year of his life should be considered void." "Can she do that?" Grace asked. "She can try," Frances said, "but we have the actual assessment from Dr. Helen Reeves, who is about as credible as they come. We also have the video from the vault. Your father was clearly lucid in that recording." "What do we do?" "We fight," Frances said. "I have already scheduled depositions with this new doctor Victoria found, and I am bringing in our own expert to review the assessment. This is just noise. She is trying to muddy the waters." But there was more than just legal maneuvering happening. Grace started noticing trucks driving slowly past the cabin. Different trucks, different drivers, always slowing down at the property line, looking at the cabin, then driving on. She saw the same white pickup 3 times in 1 week, saw a black sedan twice, started keeping a log of license plates. Her truck tires were slashed one night while it was parked by the cabin, all 4 of them. She woke up to find them flat, the sidewalls cut clean through. Hank came over and helped her change them, grumbling about cowards who worked in the dark. Then her cabin windows were broken. Someone threw rocks through 3 of the boarded-up windows in the middle of the night. Grace heard the crashes and grabbed the satellite phone, but by the time she got outside, whoever did it was gone. She found the rocks in the morning. They were the size of baseballs, and someone had painted words on them in red: "Liar, thief, go home." She showed them to Frances. The lawyer photographed them and added them to the growing file of harassment evidence. "We are documenting everything," Frances said. "When this goes to trial, the jury is going to see a pattern of intimidation and violence. It will not help Victoria's case." But Grace was getting tired. Tired of sleeping in a cabin with broken windows. Tired of checking the road every time she heard an engine. Tired of the constant low-level fear that sat in her stomach like a stone. She had been living at the cabin for 3 weeks, and it was starting to wear on her. She was losing weight, not sleeping well, starting to jump at shadows. Hank noticed. "You need a break," he said one morning. "Come stay at my trailer for a few days. Get some proper rest." Grace shook her head. "I am not leaving the cabin. If I leave, they win." "They do not win just because you get a good night's sleep," Hank said gently. "Your daddy built that vault to last. It will still be there tomorrow." But Grace stayed, because leaving felt like surrender, and she had promised her father she would give them hell. You could not give someone hell if you ran away. The toxicology results came back on a Thursday afternoon, 23 days after the exhumation. Frances called Grace immediately. "We have it," she said. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "Digoxin, high levels, well above therapeutic range." "What does that mean?" Grace asked, even though she already knew. "It means your father was poisoned," Frances said. "Digoxin is a heart medication. In high doses it causes arrhythmia, heart attack, death. Your father never had a prescription for digoxin. Someone gave it to him deliberately. Someone killed him." Grace sat down on the porch steps. She had known this was coming, had suspected it for weeks, but hearing it confirmed in cold scientific terms was different, made it real in a way it had not been before. "Can we prove it was Victoria?" "We can prove he was poisoned," Frances said. "We can prove Victoria was the only person who had regular access to his food and medication. We can prove she had motive. She had bigamy charges hanging over her. She needed him dead before he discovered it. We can prove she has done this before. The district attorney is reviewing the evidence now. I expect murder charges to be filed within the week." Grace felt tears start to slide down her face. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Frances said. "Thank your father. He knew. He documented everything. He made this possible. All we are doing is finishing what he started." That night Grace went down into the vault and sat at her father's desk. She opened his journal to the last entry, the one that said, "She is putting something in my food. I am certain of it now." She ran her fingers over the words he had written. He had known he was dying, had known who was killing him, and instead of going to the police, instead of trying to save himself, he had used the time he had left to protect her. The weight of that sacrifice was almost unbearable. He had died to give her this chance, to give her the evidence, to give her justice, and she would be damned if she was going to let him down. 2 days later, the news broke. The district attorney held a press conference announcing that Victoria Kane, also known as Victoria Hartley, was being charged with first-degree murder in the death of William Edward Hartley. Additional charges included bigamy, property fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. An arrest warrant had been issued. Victoria turned herself in that same afternoon, accompanied by her lawyers. She was processed at the county jail, fingerprinted, photographed, and released on $5 million bail. The bail was set high because of flight risk concerns. The prosecutor had presented evidence of Victoria's pattern of moving from state to state after previous husbands died. The judge agreed she was a risk and set bail accordingly. Victoria posted it within 6 hours. Grace did not know where she got the money. Presumably she had liquidated something, sold something, called in favors from someone. But she made bail and walked out of the county jail wearing sunglasses and a grim expression. The story went national within days. Cable news picked it up. Black widow arrested for killing Wyoming rancher. They showed photos of Victoria, photos of the ranch, photos of Grace standing on the courthouse steps. The comments online were vicious. People who did not know Victoria, had never met her, called her evil, called her a monster, demanded the death penalty. Grace did not read the comments. She stayed at the cabin and waited for the next move, because she knew Victoria, knew that being cornered would make her desperate, and desperate people were the most dangerous kind. The next move came faster than Grace expected. She was served with papers 3 days after Victoria made bail. A new lawsuit. This one claimed that Grace had manipulated her dying father, had used undue influence to convince him to change his will, had fabricated evidence in the vault to support false claims of poisoning, and was directly responsible for William Hartley's death through the stress and anxiety her actions had caused. Victoria was claiming that Grace had killed her own father. Frances brought the papers to the cabin personally. She was angrier than Grace had ever seen her. "This is desperation," she said. "This is a Hail Mary from someone who knows they are going to lose. No jury in the world will believe this." "But it will delay the trial," Grace said, reading through the allegations. "It will create doubt. That is what she wants, right? To muddy the waters so much that people do not know what to believe." Frances sat down on the porch steps. She looked tired. "We knew this would get ugly," she said. "We just did not know how ugly. But here is the thing. Every day this drags on, we get stronger. The toxicology is bulletproof. The bigamy is documented. The fraud is clear. Time is on our side." "It does not feel like it," Grace said. "I know," Frances said, "but trust me. We are winning, she just does not know it yet." That night, as Grace was getting ready to sleep, she heard engines again, multiple engines. She grabbed the satellite phone and looked out the window. 3 trucks were coming up the road, moving fast. They had their headlights off. Grace's heart started pounding. She dialed Hank. He answered immediately. "What is wrong?" "3 trucks," Grace said, "no lights, coming toward the cabin." "Get in the vault," Hank said. "Right now. Lock the door and do not come out until I get there." Grace ran to the trapdoor. She pulled it open and climbed down the ladder so fast she almost fell. She hit the bottom and slammed the heavy steel door at the top of the shaft. There was a bolt on the inside. She threw it. Then she turned off all the lights in the vault and sat in the darkness with her phone in her hand and her heart hammering against her ribs. Above her she heard boots on the porch, heard voices, heard someone trying the cabin door, heard it crash open, heard footsteps moving through the cabin, heavy footsteps, multiple people searching. They were in the cabin for 10 minutes. It felt like hours. Grace sat in the dark and listened to them moving around above her head, heard furniture being knocked over, heard glass breaking, heard angry voices saying, "Where is it? It has to be here somewhere." Then she heard a new sound, a truck engine, a door slamming, Hank's voice shouting, "This is private property. You boys need to leave right now." A gunshot, not from Hank's rifle, something else. Smaller caliber. Grace heard Hank shout and then she heard return fire, the boom of his rifle, once, twice, 3 times. Grace grabbed the satellite phone and dialed 911. She told the dispatcher there was a shooting, gave the location. The dispatcher said deputies were already en route. Hank had called it in. "Stay where you are. Do not come out." The shooting stopped. The engine started up again. The trucks left, moving fast. Grace waited in the darkness, counting her heartbeats, listening for sounds from above. After what felt like an eternity, she heard Hank's voice. "Miss Grace, you can come up now. They are gone." She climbed the ladder with shaking legs. When she emerged from the vault, she found Hank standing in the cabin with his rifle in one hand and his phone in the other. He had blood on his sleeve. "You are hurt," Grace said. "Just a graze," Hank said. "Bullet caught my arm. I will be fine." He looked at the cabin. They tore the place apart looking for something, probably the vault, but they did not find it. "Who were they?" Hank shrugged. "Hired men, most likely. Your stepmother getting desperate." He smiled grimly. "But they will think twice before coming back. I put 3 rounds through the windshield of their lead truck, made my point clear." The sheriff's deputies arrived 20 minutes later. They took statements, photographed the damage, collected shell casings from where the gunfight had happened. The lead deputy looked at Grace and said, "Ma'am, you need to seriously consider getting somewhere safer. This situation is escalating." "This is my land," Grace said. "I am not leaving." The deputy looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded and said, "Then we will increase patrols in this area. And I would recommend you get some security. Professional security." After the deputies left, Hank sat down on the porch and let Grace bandage his arm. The bullet had grazed his bicep, a shallow furrow that bled more than it hurt. Grace wrapped it with gauze from a first aid kit and tried not to think about how close he had come to being killed. Because of her. Because he was protecting her. "I am sorry," she said. "Do not be," Hank said. "Your daddy asked me to watch over you. I gave him my word. A man's word means something out here. You could have died." Hank looked at her with his weathered face and his calm eyes. "Miss Grace, I am 72 years old. I have lived a good life. If it ends defending a good woman's land from bad people, well, that is a death worth having. Now stop apologizing and help me figure out what we are going to do about those broken windows." They boarded up the new damage with plywood from Hank's truck. They reinforced the cabin door. They set up motion sensor lights around the perimeter. And when Frances arrived the next morning and saw the bullet holes and the broken furniture, she made a phone call that changed everything. The call was to a private security company in Cheyenne. By that afternoon, 2 armed security guards had arrived at the cabin. They were professionals, ex-military, quiet and competent. They set up a rotating watch schedule. One guard would be awake and patrolling at all times. They had night vision equipment. They had direct lines to the sheriff's department. And they made it very clear that anyone approaching the cabin without authorization would be met with force. Grace tried to object to the expense. Frances held up a hand. "Your vault has $49 million in it," she said. "We can afford security. Besides, this is not optional anymore. They tried to kill Hank. Next time they might succeed. Next time they might kill you." So Grace accepted the guards, accepted the new reality of living in an armed camp, accepted that the fight had moved from courtrooms to something more primal. Victoria was not just trying to win in court anymore. She was trying to eliminate the threat entirely. But 2 days after the security guards arrived, Frances got a phone call that made her smile for the first time in weeks. She drove out to the cabin and found Grace sitting on the porch with one of the guards. Frances got out of her truck holding a manila folder like it was a winning lottery ticket. "We found him," she said. "Russell Kane, Victoria's first husband, the one she never divorced." "Where?" Grace asked. "Cheyenne," Frances said. "Living in a cheap motel under a fake name, working as a surveyor under fraudulent credentials. And here is the beautiful part. He is broke, desperate, and very, very afraid of Victoria." Grace felt something like hope stir in her chest. "Can we use him?" Frances smiled. "We can flip him. I talked to the DA. If Russell testifies against Victoria, admits to the bigamy, admits to the property fraud, we will recommend a plea deal. Minimum sentence. Witness protection if he wants it." "Will he do it?" Frances opened the folder and pulled out a photo. It showed a man in his 50s, thin and nervous looking with a weak chin and thinning hair. "He already has," she said. "I met with him this morning. He sang like a canary, 25 years of cons, 7 dead husbands. Your father was number 8. Russell did the fake surveys, forged the documents, helped Victoria steal from grieving families, and he is willing to testify to all of it." Grace took the photo and looked at Russell Kane's face. This man had helped kill her father, had helped steal her inheritance, and now he was going to help destroy Victoria. It felt like justice, cold and mathematical and absolute. "When is the trial?" Grace asked. 6 weeks, Frances said. Judge Stone fast-tracked it given the murder charges. We have 6 weeks to prepare, 6 weeks to build an unbeatable case. She looked at Grace. How are you holding up? Grace looked around at the cabin, at the boarded windows and the bullet holes and the armed guards, at the land stretching out around her, brown and wild and beautiful, at the vault hidden beneath her feet with its $49 million and its evidence of murder. She thought about her father's journal. She thought about his video. She thought about his last words. Make them pay. I am ready, Grace said. Let us finish this. Francis nodded. Then let us go to war. The trial of Victoria Kane began on a Monday morning in early September, when the aspens on the mountains were just starting to turn gold, and the air had that crystalline quality that comes before the first snow. The Fremont County Courthouse in Lander was built in 1928, a 3-story building of native stone with tall windows and a copper dome that had weathered to green. It sat on Main Street like a monument to the idea that justice still meant something in Wyoming. By 7 in the morning, people were already lining up outside. The case had drawn attention from across the state and beyond. Cable news trucks were parked along the street, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like flowers turning toward the sun. Reporters did stand-ups on the courthouse steps, speaking into cameras about the Black Widow rancher and the daughter who had exposed her. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Ranchers in clean shirts and polished boots. Townspeople who had known William Hartley. Lawyers and law students who wanted to see Francis Blackwood at work. Journalists with notebooks and recording devices. By the time Judge Margaret Stone took the bench at 9 o'clock, every seat was taken and people were standing along the back wall. Grace sat at the defense table with Francis. She wore a simple navy suit that Francis had helped her pick out, nothing fancy, nothing that would make her look like she was trying too hard. Her mother's sapphire necklace was visible at her throat. Her hair was pulled back. She looked tired because she was tired. The last 6 weeks had been a blur of depositions and document review and sleepless nights at the cabin. But she also looked determined. She had come too far to falter now. Victoria sat at the prosecution table, which in a murder trial meant she was the defendant, surrounded by her 3 lawyers in their expensive suits. She wore black, of course. The grieving widow costume. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. Her expression was one of dignified sorrow mixed with righteous indignation. She had not looked at Grace once since entering the courtroom. It was as if Grace did not exist. As if this entire trial was some unfortunate misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up. Judge Stone entered and everyone stood. The judge was a small woman with steel gray hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. She had been a prosecutor for 15 years before becoming a judge, and she had a reputation for running a tight courtroom. She sat. Everyone else sat. The bailiff called the court to order. The trial began. The prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Marsh, 42 years old, with 15 years in the district attorney's office and a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous. She stood to give the opening statement, and her voice carried to every corner of that silent courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this is a case about greed, about betrayal, about a woman who made a career out of marrying wealthy men and then killing them. She laid out the case methodically. Victoria Kane's history of marriages to wealthy men who died under suspicious circumstances. The bigamy. The fact that Victoria was still legally married to Russell Kane when she married William Hartley. The property fraud. The way Victoria had systematically isolated William from his daughter. The journal entries where William expressed concern about being poisoned. The toxicology report showing lethal levels of digoxin in his system. The fact that William had no prescription for digoxin and no heart condition that would require it. By the time Marsh finished, the jury was leaning forward in their seats. Several of them were looking at Victoria with undisguised suspicion. Victoria sat perfectly still, her face a mask. Then it was Arthur Grimes's turn. Victoria's lead defense attorney stood and buttoned his suit jacket and addressed the jury with the smooth confidence of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. "This is a case about a vindictive daughter," he said, "who could not accept that her father had moved on after her mother's death. A daughter who invented a conspiracy theory to explain why she was left out of the will. A daughter who fabricated evidence and manipulated a grieving widow during the worst time of her life." He painted Victoria as the victim, a woman who had loved William Hartley and cared for him in his final years, a woman who was now being persecuted by a daughter who wanted money she did not deserve. He acknowledged that Victoria's first marriage had never been formally dissolved, but he called it a technicality, a paperwork error, nothing more. He said the digoxin in William's system could have come from environmental contamination. He said there was no direct evidence that Victoria had administered it. When Grimes sat down, Grace leaned over to Francis and whispered, "He is good." Francis smiled without warmth. "Wait until I cross-examine his witnesses," she said. The prosecution called its first witness, Dr. Patricia Chen, the state medical examiner who had performed the toxicology analysis. She was a small Asian woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her black hair and the precise manner of someone who dealt in facts rather than speculation. She took the stand and was sworn in, and Jennifer Marsh walked her through her findings. The digoxin levels in Mr. Hartley's system were approximately 10 times the therapeutic dose, Dr. Chen testified. This was not environmental contamination. This was pharmaceutical-grade digoxin, administered orally over a period of several days. "Could this have been accidental?" Marsh asked. "No," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Mr. Hartley had no prescription for digoxin. He had no heart condition that would require it. Someone gave him this medication deliberately and in quantities designed to cause cardiac arrest." Grimes tried to shake her on cross-examination, suggesting alternative theories, questioning her methodology, but Dr. Chen was unshakable. The science was clear. William Hartley had been poisoned. There was no other explanation that fit the evidence. The next witness was Dr. Helen Reeves, William's primary care physician for 20 years. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a calm bedside manner that had made her one of the most respected doctors in Fremont County. She testified that William had been in excellent health up until his final month. No heart problems, no cognitive issues. She had performed a thorough assessment just 3 weeks before his death, specifically at William's request. "He told me he wanted it documented that he was of sound mind," Dr. Reeves said. "He seemed concerned that someone might try to claim otherwise after he died. I found him to be completely lucid, oriented, and capable of managing his own affairs." Marsh played the video of that assessment for the jury. William sitting in the examination room, answering questions about current events, doing memory tests, discussing his estate planning with perfect clarity. The jury watched in silence. Several of them wiped their eyes when the video ended. Then came the evidence about the bigamy. County clerks testified about the marriage licenses. The one from 1998 in Las Vegas showing Victoria Kane marrying Russell Kane. The one from 2019 in Wyoming showing Victoria Kane marrying William Hartley. No divorce decree existed between them. The marriages overlapped by 21 years. A handwriting expert testified about the forged signatures on property documents, showed side-by-side comparisons of William's real signature and the forged ones that had been used to transfer Grace's land into Victoria's shell company. The forgeries were obvious once you knew what to look for. Different pen pressure, different letter formation, different rhythm. The prosecution built its case brick by brick, witness by witness, until the foundation was solid and undeniable. And then, on the third day of trial, they called Russell Kane to the stand. The courtroom went silent when Russell entered. He was wearing a prison jumpsuit because he was in custody, part of his plea agreement. He looked smaller than he did in the photos, diminished somehow, like a man who had spent his whole life running and had finally been caught. He would not look at Victoria as he walked to the witness stand. He kept his eyes down. He was sworn in. He sat. Jennifer Marsh approached. "Mr. Kane," she said, "how long have you known the defendant?" "Since 1997, Russell said. His voice was quiet. The microphone barely picked it up. The judge told him to speak louder. "And what is your relationship to the defendant?" "We are married," Russell said. "We got married in Las Vegas in June of 1998. "Did you ever divorce?" "No, ma'am." "Are you aware that the defendant married William Hartley in 2019? "Yes, ma'am." "Did she tell you she was going to do that?" "Yes, she said she had found a rich rancher, said he was worth $60 million, said we could take him for everything he had." The courtroom erupted. Judge Stone banged her gavel. "Order," she said, "order in this court." The noise died down. Marsh continued. "Did you participate in this plan?" "Yes, ma'am." Russell's voice got even quieter. "I helped her. I posed as a licensed surveyor and created fraudulent boundary surveys to steal land from Mr. Hartley's daughter. I forged signatures on property transfer documents. I helped Victoria set up shell companies to hide the stolen assets." "How many times have you done this before?" "This was the 8th time," Russell said, and for the first time he looked up. He looked directly at Victoria. His eyes were haunted. "We have been doing this for 25 years, 7 men before Mr. Hartley. We would target wealthy widowers. Victoria would seduce them, marry them. I would handle the paperwork, move assets around, make it look legal. Then we would wait for them to die." "Did you kill any of these men?" "I did not," Russell said quickly. "That was all Victoria. I swear I never knew she was killing them until it was too late. I thought they were dying natural deaths. Heart attacks, strokes. I thought we were just getting lucky." "When did you realize she was killing them?" "After the 4th one," Russell said. "The pattern was too consistent. Healthy men marrying Victoria and dying within 2 years. I confronted her. She admitted it. Said she used digoxin because it was hard to detect. Said she was careful about it. Said if I ever told anyone, she would kill me too." "Why are you telling us now?" "Because I am tired of running," Russell said. His voice broke. "I am tired of being scared. And because what she did to Mr. Hartley, what she did to his daughter, it is not right. That man was a good man. He deserved better." Grimes tried to destroy Russell on cross-examination, called him a liar, a con artist, a man testifying only to save himself from prison. But Russell held firm. He admitted he was a criminal, admitted he had helped Victoria steal from families, but he insisted he had never killed anyone. That was all Victoria. When Russell finally left the stand, the jury looked shaken. Several of them were staring at Victoria with something that looked like horror. Victoria sat stone-faced, her hands folded in her lap, her expression never changing. The prosecution rested its case on the afternoon of the 4th day. Judge Stone called a recess until the following morning. Grace walked out of the courthouse with Frances and was immediately surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Frances raised a hand. "We are confident the jury will see the truth," she said. "William Hartley was murdered. The evidence is overwhelming." That was all she said. They pushed through the crowd and got into Frances's truck and drove back to the cabin in silence. That night Grace sat in the vault with her father's journal open on the desk. She read through the entries again, all those careful observations, all that documentation of his growing suspicion. He had known what Victoria was, had known she was dangerous, and he had used the last weeks of his life to build a case that would put her in prison forever. Grace touched the page where he had written "Make them pay," and she whispered into the empty vault, "I am trying, Dad. I am trying." The defense began its case the next morning. Grimes called a series of character witnesses who testified that Victoria was a loving wife, a devoted caregiver, a woman of faith and integrity. Friends of Victoria's mostly, people she had met at church or social events. They painted a picture of a woman who was incapable of the crimes she was accused of. But then Francis got to cross-examine them, and it became clear that none of these people had known Victoria before she married William. None of them could speak to her first marriage, her time in Nevada, the mysterious deaths of previous husbands. Their testimony was superficial, easily dismissed. Grimes tried to bring in an expert witness who would claim that the toxicology could be explained by environmental factors, but the expert fell apart under Jennifer Marsh's cross-examination. Within 20 minutes, he admitted he had never actually examined the samples himself, had never even seen the full toxicology report, was basing his testimony entirely on theoretical possibilities. The defense was collapsing. Everyone in the courtroom could see it. And then Grimes made a decision that would later be remembered as one of the biggest tactical errors in Wyoming legal history. He called Victoria to the stand. Frances leaned over to Grace. "He just made a fatal mistake," she whispered. Victoria took the stand wearing a black dress and pearl earrings and an expression of wounded dignity. Grimes walked her through her version of events, how she had met William at a charity event, how they had fallen in love, how she had cared for him in his final year as his health declined, how devastated she was by his death, how shocked she was by Grace's accusations. She denied everything, said she had loved William, said she never poisoned him, said Russell was lying to save himself, said the bigamy was a mistake, a paperwork error she had not known about, said the property surveys were handled by professionals and she had trusted their work, said Grace was a vindictive daughter who was motivated by greed. When Grimes finished, Victoria looked composed and sympathetic. Several jurors seemed to be listening to her with open minds. And then Jennifer Marsh stood up for cross-examination. "Mrs. Kane," Marsh began, "or should I say Mrs. Hartley? What do you prefer to be called?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hartley." "But you were never legally Mrs. Hartley, were you? Because you were already married to Russell Kane." "That was a mistake," Victoria said. "I thought we were divorced." "You thought you were divorced," Marsh repeated, "from a man you have been meeting in motels for the past 3 years." "We were friends," Victoria said, "old friends. Friends who share hotel rooms 30 times over 3 years." "We were not having an affair," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly. "I did not say affair," Marsh said. "I said you were meeting in hotel rooms. What were you doing in those hotel rooms, Mrs. Kane?" Victoria hesitated, "Just talking." Marsh pulled out a stack of photos, the private investigator's surveillance, Victoria and Russell entering motel rooms, coming out hours later. The timestamps were damning. Marsh showed them to the jury one by one. "Just talking," she said, "for hours in motels, while you were married to William Hartley." Victoria's face was turning red. "We were discussing business." "What business?" Victoria did not answer. Marsh moved on. "Let us talk about the digoxin," she said. "You claim you never gave it to William Hartley. Is that correct?" "That is correct." "Who cooked Mr. Hartley's meals in the final months of his life?" "I did," Victoria said. "Who gave him his medications?" "I helped him with that." "So you had access to everything he ate and drank?" "I was his wife," Victoria said. "Of course I did." "And yet you expect this jury to believe that someone else, some mysterious unknown person, managed to poison him with a medication he was never prescribed. Victoria's eyes flashed. I did not poison my husband. Then where did the digoxin come from? I do not know, Victoria said. Convenient, Marsh said. She pulled out another document. This is a receipt from a pharmacy in Casper, Wyoming, dated 6 months before William's death. It shows a purchase of digoxin tablets. The buyer's name is Victoria Kane. She handed it to Victoria. Is that your signature? Victoria stared at the receipt. The courtroom was silent. No, she said, that is forged. Really? Marsh said. She handed the receipt to the handwriting expert who had testified earlier. The expert examined it and nodded. That is Mrs. Kane's signature, the expert said. Same pressure patterns, same letter formation. It is genuine. Victoria's composure was cracking. Someone is framing me, she said. Who? Marsh asked. Who would go to such elaborate lengths to frame you? Grace, Victoria said, pointing across the courtroom. She is the one who wanted her father dead. She manipulated him. She made him change his will. She probably poisoned him herself and then blamed me. Judge Stone's gavel came down hard. Mrs. Kane, control yourself. But Victoria was beyond control now. The mask was slipping. Her voice was getting louder. That little bitch has been trying to destroy me from the start. She could not stand that her father moved on after her mother died. She could not stand that he chose me over her. Mrs. Kane, Judge Stone warned. Victoria ignored her. She was looking at Grace now, rage burning in her eyes. He loved me. The ranch was mine. Everything was mine. And you, she spat the word, you with your pathetic little cabin and your lies. You do not deserve any of it. You are nothing, just like you have always been nothing. The courtroom erupted. The bailiff moved toward Victoria. Judge Stone was banging her gavel and shouting for order. Grimes was trying to get Victoria to stop talking, but she was past listening. She stood up from the witness stand, pointing at Grace, her face twisted with fury. I earned that ranch, Victoria screamed. I put up with that old man for 5 years. 5 years of his boring stories and his pathetic devotion to a dead wife. I deserved to be paid for that. I deserved everything. Grimes finally got her to sit down. Judge Stone called a recess. The jury was escorted out. Victoria sat at the defense table breathing hard, her perfect composure completely shattered. Grace sat perfectly still and watched her stepmother fall apart and felt something like sadness. Not for Victoria. For her father, who had been fooled by this woman, who had loved her and trusted her and been betrayed in the worst possible way. The trial resumed after lunch. Grimes tried to salvage the situation, arguing that Victoria had been under enormous stress, that her outburst should not be held against her. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the real Victoria Kane. The mask had fallen off and revealed the monster underneath. Closing arguments the next day were almost anticlimactic. Jennifer Marsh summarized the evidence calmly and methodically. The bigamy, the fraud, the pattern of dead husbands, the digoxin receipt, the toxicology, William's journal entries, Russell's testimony, Victoria's own confession in her moment of rage. We heard her say it, Marsh told the jury. I earned that ranch. I deserved everything. Those are not the words of an innocent woman. Those are the words of a killer. Grimes did his best to argue reasonable doubt, but his heart was not in it. How could it be? His client had confessed to motive on the witness stand, had admitted she felt entitled to William's money, had called him an old man she had put up with for 5 years. No amount of legal maneuvering could undo that. The jury got the case at 3 in the afternoon. They deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, their faces were grim. The foreman stood. The clerk read the charges. Murder in the first degree. How do you find? We find the defendant guilty. Bigamy, guilty. Property fraud, guilty. Conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. Guilty on all counts. Victoria sat frozen as the verdicts were read. When the foreman said guilty for the sixth time, she made a small sound, almost like a whimper. The bailiff moved to take her into custody. She looked at her lawyers. They looked away. She looked at Grace. Grace met her eyes and did not look away, did not smile, did not gloat, just looked at the woman who had killed her father and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction that justice had been done. The bailiff put handcuffs on Victoria and led her out of the courtroom. She did not resist. She walked like someone in a dream, like she could not quite believe this was happening. The courtroom remained silent until she was gone. Then people started to talk all at once, a rising wave of noise. Grace sat in the middle of it and felt Francis's hand on her shoulder. "You did it," Francis said quietly. "You finished what your father started." Grace nodded. She could not speak. If she spoke, she would cry, and she did not want to cry here, not in front of all these people. She wanted to go back to the cabin, to the vault, to sit at her father's desk and tell him it was over, tell him they had won. But there was still one more piece of business to attend to: the civil case, the property dispute. Judge Stone had scheduled a hearing for the following week to rule on ownership of the disputed land. That hearing was mercifully brief. With Victoria convicted of fraud, her ownership claims were void. The fraudulent surveys were thrown out. The original property boundaries were restored, and that was when Francis introduced the final piece of evidence. It was a document from the county records office, dated 1985, a land grant showing that when William Hartley married Sarah Miller, he had married into her family's land, 12,000 acres that Sarah had inherited from her parents. That land had been held in trust for Sarah's heirs, meaning Grace, after Sarah's death in 2006. William had been the trustee, but the land had never legally been his to give away or mortgage. It was Grace's by birthright. And that 12,000 acres included not just the foreman's cabin, but a significant portion of what everyone thought was the main ranch. Judge Stone read the land grant carefully. She looked at the surveys. She looked at the original deeds. She looked at Grace. Then she made her ruling. The court finds that the property known as the Hartley Ranch, totaling approximately 15,000 acres, is comprised of two separate parcels. The first parcel, approximately 3,000 acres including the main ranch house, was owned by William Hartley. The second parcel, approximately 12,000 acres including the foreman's cabin, was inherited by Sarah Hartley and held in trust for her daughter Grace. Upon William Hartley's death, the 3,000-acre parcel should have passed to his legal spouse. However, since Victoria Kane was not his legal spouse due to bigamy, and since Williams will name no other beneficiaries, that parcel escheats to his only living heir, Grace Hartley. The court therefore rules that Grace Hartley is the sole legal owner of the entire 15,000-acre Hartley Ranch property. The courtroom was silent. Grace felt the world tilt. She had come here fighting for her cabin and 120 acres. She was leaving with the entire ranch, 15,000 acres, the mansion, the cattle, the equipment, everything. But there was more. The ranch was mortgaged for $35 million, a debt that Victoria had incurred. Judge Stone addressed that next. Since the mortgage was obtained through fraudulent means, using forged signatures and false property claims, it is void. The bank's claim is dismissed. Miss Hartley takes the property free and clear of all encumbrances. Francis was gripping Grace's hand so hard it hurt. "Do you understand what just happened?" Francis whispered. "You own it all, everything, and you owe nothing." Grace understood. Her father had planned this, had set up the trust structure, had documented everything, had made sure that when the fraud was exposed, everything would come back to where it belonged, to his daughter, to Sarah's daughter, to the rightful heir. They walked out of the courthouse into September sunshine. The aspens on the mountains were gold now, blazing against the blue sky. Reporters shouted questions, but Frances waved them off. "Not today," she said. "Miss Hartley needs time to process this." They drove back to the cabin. Hank was there, sitting on the porch with his rifle and his coffee, and when he saw their faces he stood up. "We won?" he asked. "We won," Grace said, and then she told him about the verdict, about the property ruling, about how the entire ranch was now hers. Hank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he smiled. A real smile, the first one Grace had seen from him in weeks. "Your daddy would be so proud," he said. "He planned this whole thing, did not he? Every piece of it." Grace nodded. He did. He knew exactly what he was doing. That night, Grace went down into the vault one last time as the owner of nothing but a cabin and 120 acres. She sat at her father's desk and opened his journal to the last page. She read his final words, "Make them pay." And then she picked up a pen and wrote her own entry below his. "I did, Dad. I made them pay. Victoria is going to prison for the rest of her life. The ranch is ours again, all of it, everything Mom left me. Everything you protected, I am bringing it home. I am bringing us home. Thank you for everything, for the vault, for the evidence, for believing I was strong enough to finish this. I love you. I will make you proud, your Gracie." She closed the journal. She turned off the computer monitors. She stood in the center of the vault and looked around at the bins of money, the gold bars, the filing cabinets full of evidence. $49 million and the truth, her father's final gift. Tomorrow she would start the process of moving that wealth somewhere safer, of setting up proper accounts, of hiring advisors, of figuring out what to do with a 15,000-acre ranch and more money than she had ever imagined having. But tonight, she just wanted to sit here in the place her father had built for her and feel close to him one more time. She climbed the ladder back to the cabin. Hank and the security guards were outside, talking quietly. They had become friends over the past weeks, these men who had risked their lives to protect her land. Grace walked out onto the porch and looked at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars her mother and father had looked at when they stood in front of this cabin 40 years ago and dreamed of building a life together. "We did it," Grace whispered to the stars, to her mother, to her father, to everyone who had loved this land before her. "We brought it home." And somewhere in the darkness, she could almost hear her father's voice saying, "I know you would, Gracie girl. I always knew." The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the verdict, on a cold October morning when the first snow had already fallen in the mountains, and the valley below was waiting for winter. Victoria Kane was brought into the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, no longer the polished woman in designer clothes, but a prisoner who had not slept well in weeks. The jury had convicted her. Now Judge Margaret Stone would decide how many years she would spend in prison for what she had done. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been during the trial. The reporters had mostly moved on to other stories, but Grace was there, sitting in the front row with Frances and Hank. She wore the same navy suit she had worn to the trial, and her mother's sapphire necklace caught the light from the tall windows. Judge Stone took the bench. Everyone stood, then sat. The judge looked at Victoria with an expression that held no sympathy, only a kind of weary disappointment. She had presided over hundreds of cases in her 25 years on the bench, but this one would be remembered. A black widow who had killed for money, a daughter who had exposed her. Justice served in a way that reminded people why they still believed in courts and juries and the rule of law. "Victoria Kane," Judge Stone began, "you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of murder in the first degree, bigamy, property fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Before I pass sentence, I want to say something about the nature of your crimes. You did not kill in a moment of passion. You did not kill in self-defense. You killed William Hartley deliberately and with premeditation over a period of days, administering poison in quantities designed to mimic natural death. You did this for money, for land, for assets you had no legal right to claim, and the evidence suggests you have done this before to other men in other states, leaving a trail of grieving families who never knew the truth. The judge paused. The courtroom was silent. Victoria stared at the table in front of her, her jaw clenched, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles were white. The law provides for certain sentences for certain crimes, Judge Stone continued. For first-degree murder, the sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole. For your other crimes, I am sentencing you to an additional 15 years, to run consecutively. This means, Mrs. Kane, that you will spend the rest of your natural life in the Wyoming Women's Center. You will never be free again. And perhaps in the years you have left, you will come to understand the magnitude of what you have taken from this world. A good man, a loving father, a life that mattered to people. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. The gavel came down. Victoria made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The bailiff moved to take her out. As she stood, she looked across the courtroom at Grace. Their eyes met. Grace saw fear there now and regret, and something that might have been hatred. But mostly she saw a broken woman who had gambled everything and lost. Victoria was led out through the side door. The last Grace saw of her stepmother was the orange jumpsuit disappearing down the hallway toward the holding cells. Then she was gone. Gone from Grace's life. Gone from the world. Locked away where she could never hurt anyone again. Frances put a hand on Grace's shoulder. "It is over," she said quietly. "You can go home now." Grace nodded, but she did not feel relief. Not yet. She felt something else. A kind of emptiness where the anger had been. She had spent 3 months fighting. 3 months living on adrenaline and determination and the need for justice. Now that it was over, she did not quite know what to do with herself. They walked out of the courthouse into the October cold. The sky was gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. Grace pulled her coat tighter and looked at the mountains in the distance, white peaks against gray clouds, beautiful and indifferent to human drama. Hank was waiting by Frances's truck, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. "Life sentence," Frances told him, "plus 15 years." Hank nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That woman does not deserve to see another sunrise outside of a cell." They drove back to the cabin in silence. Grace looked out the window at the passing landscape, brown hills and scattered junipers, and the occasional cluster of cattle huddled against the wind. This was all hers now. 15,000 acres. More land than she knew what to do with. More responsibility than she had ever asked for. "What am I going to do with a ranch?" she had asked Frances the night after the property ruling. Frances had smiled. "Whatever you want," she had said. "It is yours. No debt. No mortgage. No one telling you what to do with it. You can run cattle. You can turn it into a nature preserve. You can sell it and live on the money for the rest of your life. The choice is yours." But Grace did not want to sell it. That much she knew. This land had been her mother's, had been her grandmother's and her great-grandmother's before that. 4 generations of women who had loved this harsh country and made lives here. Grace could not sell that. It would be like selling her own history. They reached the cabin as the first fat snowflakes began to fall. The security guards had left a week ago, their job done. The cabin sat alone on its hilltop, looking small and weathered against the vastness of the sky. Grace got out of the truck and stood in the falling snow and looked at the place that had saved her, that had given her shelter and secrets and the tools to fight back. "I need to see the ranch house," she said suddenly. "The mansion. I have not been there since the trial started." Frances looked at her. "Are you sure?" "I need to see it," Grace repeated. "I need to decide what to do with it." They drove south across the property, following 2-track roads that Grace barely remembered. The ranch house sat on a rise overlooking a valley where cattle had once grazed by the thousands. It was a massive structure, 8,000 square feet of logs and stone and glass, built to impress, built to show the world that William Hartley had made something of himself. Grace had grown up in that house, had learned to ride horses in the pastures below it, had sat on the wide porch with her father on summer evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains. But when they crested the final hill and the house came into view, Grace's breath caught. It was not the mansion she remembered. The roof had partially collapsed. Several windows were broken. The logs were weathered and splitting. Victoria had let it fall into disrepair in the 3 years since she had banned Grace from the property. Or maybe it had been falling apart all along and Grace had just not seen it. Either way, it looked sad now, like a monument to something that had ended badly. They got out of the truck. Grace walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The great room with its vaulted ceiling and massive stone fireplace was empty. Victoria had sold most of the furniture to pay legal fees. The walls were bare. The floor was covered in dust and mouse droppings. It smelled of abandonment and decay. Grace walked from room to room. Her old bedroom empty now, with faded rectangles on the wall where posters had hung. Her father's study, the massive desk gone, the bookshelves empty. The kitchen where her mother had cooked meals for ranch hands and neighbors, now dark and cold. Every room was a ghost of something that used to be. She found herself in her parents' bedroom on the second floor. This room still had furniture, a bed, a dresser. Victoria had not bothered to sell it. Grace walked to the window and looked out at the valley below. From here you could see for miles. See the cattle in the distance. See the line of cottonwoods that marked where a creek ran through the property. See the mountains beyond, eternal and beautiful. But Grace felt nothing. This house meant nothing to her. It was just wood and stone, just a structure that had outlived its purpose. Her parents had built it as a symbol of success, but success was cold comfort when you were alone. Her father had learned that lesson too late, had spent the last years of his life in this big empty house with a woman who was planning to kill him. That was not the legacy Grace wanted to honor. She went back downstairs and found Frances waiting by the truck. "What are you thinking?" Frances asked. Grace looked at the house one more time. "I want to tear it down," she said. The words surprised her even as she said them, but they felt right. "I want to tear it down and build something that matters, something that would make my parents proud." "What did you have in mind?" "A community center," Grace said, "for ranch families. A place where kids can learn about land stewardship and sustainable ranching, where families can get help when times are tough, where the history of this valley can be preserved." She looked at Frances. "My father spent 40 years building this ranch, but the ranch was never the point. The land was the point, the people who work it, the families who depend on it. I want to honor that." Frances smiled. "Your father would like that," she said. Over the next month, Grace made decisions. She hired a ranch manager, a quiet man in his 50s named Tom Reeves who had worked cattle in Wyoming his whole life and knew the land like he knew his own face in the mirror. She told him to reduce the herd to sustainable levels, to focus on quality over quantity, to treat the land like it was a living thing that needed care, not a resource to be exploited. She hired contractors to demolish the mansion. They came with heavy equipment and tore it down in 3 days, reducing 40 years of her father's pride to rubble and salvageable lumber. Grace watched from a distance, feeling nothing but a strange sense of relief. The house had been a weight she did not know she was carrying. Now it was gone. She took $10 million from the vault and established the Sarah and William Hartley Memorial Fund. It would provide scholarships for kids from ranch families who wanted to go to college. It would offer grants to ranchers who wanted to implement conservation practices. It would support the land and the people who loved it. Frances helped her set up the legal structure, making sure the money would last for generations. But the cabin Grace kept for herself. She hired a different contractor, a craftsman who specialized in historic restoration, and she told him she wanted the cabin restored exactly as it had been when her parents had first made it their home. The structure itself dated back to the 1940s, built originally as a lined shack for seasonal ranch hands. But when her parents had discovered it in 1985, it had been abandoned for years, rotting and forgotten. They had spent months rebuilding it with their own hands, replacing rotten logs, installing new windows, making it livable again. That restoration in 1986 had been their first real home together. Now Grace wanted to honor that work. New logs to replace any that had deteriorated since. New windows matching the style her parents had chosen. New roof, but the same footprint, the same feel. She wanted it to look like it had looked when her parents sat on the porch in the evenings, young and happy and building a life together. While the contractor worked, Grace stayed in a hotel in Riverton. It was the first time in months that she had slept in a real bed, showered in a real bathroom, eaten food that had not come from a can. It felt strange, soft, wrong somehow. She found herself missing the cabin, missing the simplicity of it, missing the vault beneath it, that secret room where her father had left her everything that mattered. One afternoon in early November, the contractor called. "We found something," he said, "in the vault. You should come see this." Grace drove out to the cabin immediately. The contractor met her at the door. He was a man in his 60s with calloused hands and a weathered face, the kind of man who had built things his whole life and took pride in doing it right. "We were cleaning out the vault to make sure the foundation was sound," he said. "Found a metal box in the back corner, behind one of the filing cabinets. Figured you would want to open it yourself." He led her down to the vault. The space looked different now. Most of the money had been moved to secure bank accounts. The filing cabinets had been emptied, their contents scanned and stored digitally. But the desk was still there, and her father's chair, and the feeling of the place. That sense of purpose. Of a man who had loved his daughter enough to spend the last months of his life building a fortress for her. The contractor pointed to a metal box sitting on the desk. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of steel with a simple latch. Grace picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She opened the latch. Inside was a leather-bound photo album and an envelope with her name on it. Grace sat down in her father's chair. She opened the album. The first photograph was black and white, the edges worn with age. It showed a young man and a young woman standing in front of the cabin. The cabin looked different in the photo, newly restored, the logs still golden from recent replacement, the windows clear and new, the porch straight and level. The man had his arm around the woman's shoulders. They were both smiling, the kind of smile that comes from pure happiness. Grace recognized them immediately. Her mother and father, 40 years younger than she had ever known them. She turned the page. More photos. Her mother pregnant, sitting on the cabin porch, one hand on her swollen belly. Her mother holding a baby, Grace herself, wrapped in a blanket. Her father teaching a toddler to walk, his big hands holding her small ones. Photo after photo of a young family making a life in this remote place. There was a caption under one of the photos, written in her mother's handwriting. "Our first real home, April 1986, it said. "We found this abandoned old line shack and spent 6 months rebuilding it with our own hands. We have nothing but each other and this land and the work we have done. We have never been richer." Grace felt tears start to slide down her face. She wiped them away and kept turning pages. Her parents had lived here, in this cabin, before they built the mansion, before the ranch grew into an empire, when it was just the two of them and a baby and the satisfaction of making something beautiful from ruins. She found a page with no photos, just text. Her mother's handwriting again, longer this time, like a journal entry. The date was April 1986, a month before Grace was born. Will and I have decided something, the entry read. When our daughter is old enough to understand, we will tell her that this cabin is special, not because it is fancy, not because it is big, but because it is ours. We found it falling apart and gave it new life. We replaced every rotten log. We fixed every broken window. We learned what we were capable of when we worked together. The ranch house we are planning, that is for business, for showing the world we can succeed. But this cabin, this is for us. This is where we will always come back to when we need to remember who we are. This is where we learned that the best things in life are not given to you. They are things you build with your own hands. Grace put the album down. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on it in her father's handwriting, but the ink was faded, the paper yellowed with age. This letter had been written years ago. She opened it carefully. "Dearest Gracie," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone, and I pray you have found the vault. I pray you have found the truth. I pray you have won. I am writing this letter in 2021, 3 years before my death, when I first discovered what Victoria was. I know what she plans to do. I know how it will end. But I also know you. I know you are strong. I know you are smart. I know you will fight. And when the fighting is done, when justice has been served, I want you to know something important. The cabin is not a punishment. It never was. Your mother and I found this land in 1985, a year before we married. We found the old foreman's cabin here, built back in the 1940s, abandoned and rotting. We spent 1986 restoring it, rebuilding it with our own hands. You were conceived here in the bedroom upstairs, while we were still working on the walls. Your mother sang to you here before you were born, hammering nails and painting trim with you growing inside her. We were poor then, happy and poor. We had 100 acres and a dream and the satisfaction of creating something real, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Then your mother got sick and I got scared. I thought I needed to build something bigger, something that would last, something that would take care of you after we were gone. So I built the ranch, grew it year after year. Bought more land, more cattle, built that big house on the hill, and somewhere in all that building I forgot what mattered. I forgot that the cabin was where we were happiest, where we were real, where we proved to ourselves that we could take something broken and make it whole. The ranch was just business. The cabin was home. When Victoria came into my life, I was lonely and stupid. She saw the ranch and wanted it. She saw the big house and the money and the success. But she never asked about the cabin, never cared about this place. And that is how I knew she could never understand what real wealth is. Real wealth is not what you show the world. It is what you keep hidden. It is what you protect. It is what you build with your own hands. I am giving you the cabin because I am giving you the only thing that ever mattered. I am bringing you home, Gracie. The place where your mother and I were young and in love and building a life from ruins. The place where you began. This is your inheritance. Not the money in the vault, though that is yours too. Not the ranch, though you will own that as well when the truth comes out. The inheritance is this. The knowledge that you belong here. That this land is your blood. That the best things are not given but built. That you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Live simply. Love deeply. Protect this place. Build things that matter. And when you sit on the porch and watch the sunset, know that your mother and I are there with you. Always. With all my love, Dad. Grace folded the letter carefully. She sat in the vault for a long time, holding the photo album and the letter, crying quietly. Not sad tears, grateful tears, understanding tears. Her father had not abandoned her. He had given her the only thing that mattered. He had brought her home to a place her parents had rebuilt from ruins, just as she would rebuild her own life from the ruins Victoria had tried to create. The cabin was finished 2 weeks before Christmas. The contractor had done beautiful work. The logs were golden and straight, carefully chosen to match the original restoration her parents had done. The windows were new but built in the old style, with real wood frames exactly like the ones her mother and father had installed. The roof was metal, the kind that would last 50 years. The porch was level and strong, with a swing at one end and rocking chairs at the other, positioned just as they had been in the old photographs. Inside, the rooms were simple but warm. A wood stove in the living room. A small kitchen with modern appliances hidden behind cabinet doors that looked 100 years old. 2 bedrooms upstairs, simple and clean. The vault remained beneath it all, unchanged, a secret room that only Grace and a handful of trusted people knew existed. She had left one filing cabinet down there, filled with copies of all the evidence from the trial, a record of what had happened, what Victoria had done, what Grace had overcome. She had also left her father's desk and chair. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would go down there and sit at that desk and write in a journal of her own, adding her story to his. She moved into the cabin on a Saturday in December, when the valley was white with snow, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only happens in Wyoming winters. Hank helped her carry in boxes. Frances came by with a housewarming gift, a beautiful quilt that she said her grandmother had made. Tom Reeves, the ranch manager, stopped by with his wife to welcome her officially to the property. That night Grace sat alone in the cabin with a fire burning in the wood stove and snow falling softly outside. She made dinner on the stove, simple food, beans and cornbread and coffee. She ate at the small wooden table her father had built and listened to the fire pop and crackle. There was no television, no internet, just silence and firelight and the sense of being exactly where she belonged. After dinner, she went upstairs to the bedroom and opened the closet. She had moved her mother's jewelry here from the vault, the sapphire necklace, the diamond bracelet, the pearls. She took out the sapphire necklace and put it on. Then she went back downstairs and pulled on her coat and boots and walked outside. The snow had stopped. The stars were coming out, thousands of them, more than you could ever see in a city. Grace walked to the spot where the contractor had planted a new juniper tree, replacing the one her parents had planted in 1986 after they finished the restoration. She stood there in the cold and the starlight and looked at her land, 12,000 acres of it stretching away in every direction. Hers to protect, hers to love, hers to pass down someday to whoever came after her. "Thank you," she whispered to the stars, to her parents, to the land itself. "Thank you for bringing me home." 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring. The snow melted and the grass turned green and wildflowers bloomed in places Grace had never seen them before. The ranch prospered under Tom's management. The cattle were healthy. The land was healing from years of overgrazing. The community center where the mansion had stood was under construction, a beautiful building of stone and timber that looked like it belonged to the landscape. Grace settled into a rhythm. She woke with the sun. She made coffee and sat on the porch and watched the valley come alive with morning light. She worked in the garden she had planted, growing vegetables and herbs like her mother had done. She rode horses with Hank, checking fence lines and water sources, learning the land the way her grandparents had learned it. She met with Tom weekly to discuss ranch operations. She reviewed scholarship applications for the Memorial Fund. She lived simply and deliberately, turning down invitations to social events in town, preferring the quiet of the cabin to the noise of crowds. People in Riverton called her a hermit. Some said it was sad, a young woman with millions of dollars living alone in a cabin like a pioneer. But Grace did not care what they said. She knew what she had. She had peace. She had purpose. She had a home that meant something. In May, Frances came to visit. They sat on the porch drinking iced tea and watching thunderheads build over the mountains. Frances was semi-retired now, taking only the cases that interested her, spending more time fishing and less time in courtrooms. She looked relaxed in a way Grace had never seen before. "You look good," Frances said, happy. "I am," Grace said. "I really am." "Any regrets? About not keeping the mansion? About living out here alone?" Grace shook her head. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be. I know that now. Dad knew it too. That is why he left me this place. Not because it was worth money, but because it was worth everything. He was a smart man, Francis said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the clouds. Then Francis said, I heard Victoria tried to appeal her conviction. Her new lawyer argued ineffective counsel, said Grimes should never have put her on the stand. What happened? Grace asked. Appeal was denied, Francis said. Judge ruled that Victoria made her own decision to testify against her lawyer's advice. The conviction stands. She will die in prison, Grace. She will never get out. Grace nodded. She felt nothing. No satisfaction. No anger. Victoria was a closed chapter. A sad woman who had made terrible choices and was paying for them. Grace did not need to think about her anymore. Francis left before dinner. Grace watched her truck disappear down the two-track road, dust rising in the still air. Then she went inside and made herself a simple meal and ate it while reading a book about sustainable ranching. After dinner, she walked out to the small cemetery on the hillside where her parents were buried. The contractor had built a low stone wall around the graves and planted native grasses inside it. Grace had commissioned simple headstones. Sarah Hartley, beloved wife and mother. William Hartley, devoted husband and father. The dates of their births and deaths. Nothing fancy. Nothing that tried to summarize lives that were too big for words. Grace sat on the ground between the graves, leaning back against her mother's headstone. She pulled out the letter her father had written and read it again, though she had it memorized by now. Live simply. Love deeply. Protect this place. Build things that matter. I am trying, Dad, she said to the stone. I am really trying. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink and purple. The valley below was in shadow, but the mountains still caught the light, glowing like they were lit from within. A coyote called in the distance. The wind rustled through the grass. Grace sat and watched the day end and felt more at peace than she had felt in her entire life. A year after the trial, on a warm June evening when the days were long and the light seemed to last forever, Grace hosted a gathering at the cabin. It was a small group. Hank and his daughter who had driven up from Colorado. Tom Reeves and his wife and their 2 kids. Frances and her partner, a quiet woman who taught history at the community college. Dr. Helen Reeves, who had testified about Grace's father's sound mind. A few ranchers from neighboring properties who had known William and Sarah. They ate barbecue that Hank had cooked on a grill he had brought in his truck. They drank cold beer and lemonade. The kids ran around in the meadow, chasing grasshoppers. The adults sat on the porch and told stories about William Hartley, remembering the man he had been before Victoria, the good neighbor and fair boss and loving father. As the sun started to set, Grace stood and raised her glass. I want to thank you all for coming, she said, for being here, for helping me through the hardest year of my life. My father left me something more valuable than money or land. He left me the truth, and he left me all of you. This place, this cabin, this land, it is not just mine. It belongs to everyone who loves it, who protects it, who understands what it means. So thank you for being part of this, for being family. They raised their glasses. To Will, Hank said, and to Grace, who finished what he started. They drank. The sun touched the horizon. The sky blazed gold. And Grace looked around at the faces of these people, this chosen family, and knew that she was rich beyond measure. Not because of the money in bank accounts or the acres in deeds, but because she had this: community, purpose, home. After everyone left, Grace cleaned up the paper plates and beer cans. She put away the leftover food. She banked the fire in the wood stove. Then she went upstairs to her bedroom and opened the window to let in the night air. She could hear the creek running over stones in the distance. Could hear an owl calling from the cottonwoods. Could hear the vast silence of the land. She lay down on the bed, her mother's sapphire necklace still around her neck, and she thought about the journey that had brought her here. the funeral where Victoria had checked her watch, the will reading where she had been given a worthless cabin, the discovery of the vault, the evidence, the trial, the victory, and finally this peace, home, belonging. She thought about Victoria in her prison cell, staring at concrete walls, living with the knowledge of what she had done. She thought about Kyle, who had taken a plea deal and was serving 8 years in federal prison for his role in the money laundering. She thought about Russell Kane, who had disappeared into witness protection and would never be seen again. They had all lost everything, and Grace had gained everything, not because she was smarter or stronger or better, but because her father had loved her enough to plan for this, to build this safety for her, to bring her home to a place that represented everything real and lasting. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn. She made coffee and carried it out to the porch. The eastern sky was just starting to lighten, that deep blue before sunrise that is neither night nor day. She sat in the rocking chair her father had built decades ago and watched the light come. This was her routine now. Every morning she greeted the day from this porch. Every evening she watched it end from this same spot. The cabin that everyone had thought was worthless had become the center of her life, the foundation of everything good she was building. The sun broke over the eastern hills, spilling gold across the valley. Grace sipped her coffee and felt the warmth of it spread through her chest. She thought about the photo album, about her parents standing in front of this cabin in 1986, young and happy and proud of the home they had restored with their own hands. She thought about what her mother had written. "We have never been richer." Now Grace understood. Wealth was not what you owned. It was what you loved, what you protected, what you were willing to fight for, what you built with your own hands and your own heart. Victoria had spent her life chasing money and ended up with nothing. Grace had been given a ruined cabin and ended up with everything that mattered. She finished her coffee and stood. There was work to do, fence to mend on the north pasture, a scholarship committee meeting in the afternoon, dinner to make for Hank, who was coming over to help her plant trees along the creek. Simple work, honest work, the kind of work that made you tired in a good way and let you sleep sound at night. As she walked back into the cabin, she touched the door frame. The wood was solid under her hand, real, permanent. This was not just a house, it was a legacy. 4 generations of women had loved this land. Sarah's grandmother, Sarah's mother, Sarah herself, and now Grace. Each one adding to the story, each one protecting what mattered, each one proving that the most valuable things were not inherited but built. Grace went inside and started her day. And if her father's ghost was watching from wherever the dead go when they are finally at rest, he would have seen his daughter exactly where he had always hoped she would be. Not in a mansion, not in a city, not chasing success or money or approval, but here, in the foreman's cabin that he and Sarah had restored from ruins, on the land that was her blood, living the kind of life that made you rich in ways that mattered. The cabin that everyone had called worthless had turned out to be a kingdom after all, not because of what was under it, though the vault and its secrets had served their purpose, but because of what it represented: home, family, truth, legacy, the things you cannot buy, the things you can only build with your own hands and protect with your whole heart. Grace Hartley had been given a ruined cabin instead of an inheritance, and she had discovered that the cabin was the inheritance, the only one that ever mattered, the only one worth fighting for, the only one that would last. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at her land, stretching away to the mountains, and she smiled, because she knew something now that she had not known a year ago. She knew that her father had not left her nothing. He had left her everything. He had left her the truth. He had left her a home her parents had built from an abandoned ruin. He had left her the understanding that real wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the things you create and protect and love. And she was home,